They say an alpha never breaks. That's the first lie power teaches you. Vaelor didn't break the night she left. He shattered, quietly, behind closed doors, the way mountains crack before an avalanche nobody sees coming. 1 year of building something real. One night that burned it all to ash. And now he stands in an empire that still kneels before him, inside a palace that still fears him, completely, utterly alone. If you've ever watched someone you trusted choose someone else, stay until the end. This one's gonna hurt in the best way. Hit like, and drop your city below. You're part of this tribe now. The morning Seris left, the fire in the eastern hearth was still burning. Vaelor noticed that first. Not the empty bed, not the absence of her leather-bound manuscripts stacked beside the window. Not even the silence where her breathing used to shape the dark. He noticed the fire. She had built it herself before she left, the way she always did in winter, stacking birchwood with the methodical patience of someone who had learned warmth was not a thing you could expect other people to maintain for you. The wood caught cleanly. The heat spread the way her presence always did, quietly, without announcement, in ways you only recognized after it was gone. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The chamber carried her scent still, pale winter sage and old ink, the particular combination that had become, over nearly a year, something he no longer consciously registered until this precise moment when it existed without her body to anchor it. It was the scent of what remained after the source departed, an archaeologist's definition of ruins. Outside, dawn was just beginning to tear the sky open above the obsidian towers of House Draxon, and the Empire, his empire, was waking to a morning that did not yet know what it had lost. Servants moved through corridors below. The kitchen fires had been lit. The Wolf Guard changed their rotation at the gate with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood that power depended on the performance of normalcy, even when the interior was anything but. Vaelor let them perform. He walked to her reading chair, a low, curved thing of dark wood and green velvet that she had dragged herself from the Western Library, because the ones in the royal chambers were too decorative to actually be comfortable, and he sat down in it. Not his throne, not the great carved seat in the war room where maps and borders and blood politics demanded his presence. Her chair, the one that held the particular depression of someone who spent long nights bent over text rather than sleeping. He sat in it because it was the only honest furniture in the room. The wolf bond told him nothing new. It had gone silent in the night like a candle extinguished beneath a cupped palm, deliberate, controlled, final. Not the violent tearing of death, something worse. The precise severance of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and had chosen to do it completely. Seris had studied blood law for 15 years before she ever set foot in his palace. She knew every clause of every ancient treaty governing the sacred bond. If she had made a legal decision, she had made it without loopholes. He would find no threads to pull, no technical arguments through which to reach her. She had not fled. She had excised herself. Vaelor pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, where the absence lived now like a brand cooled to scar. He had felt injury before, blade wounds, war-hardened muscles torn in battle, the blunt arithmetic of physical damage that healed and left its evidence in white lines across his skin. This was nothing like that. This was the unique agony of something interior dissolving. Not one catastrophic rupture, but a continuous slow recession, like winter consuming the last warmth from stone walls. He thought about the night before. He made himself think about it. That was the only form of honesty left available to him. He had heard her in the corridor at the second hour past midnight, her soft footfall distinctive in a palace where every other person either stomped with authority or crept with servility. Seris moved the way she thought, deliberately, efficiently, without performance. He had not called out, had not warned her. He had been standing in the eastern corridor himself when she turned the corner toward the restricted wing, and he watched her approach the partially open door without understanding, in that first suspended moment, what he was witnessing. He had not processed it yet. The mechanics of betrayal are strange. They require a beat of incomprehension before the meaning floods in, that single terrible second where the mind still insists on alternative explanations. Seris had no such delay. She stopped in the doorway, 6 feet from him. The light from inside the room fell across her face in golden shadow, and he watched understanding arrive in her expression not with violence, but with a terrible stillness. The worst kind. The kind that means someone has located the exact shape of what they already feared. She looked at him. Not inside the room. At him. And in the half-second before she turned away, he saw something in her eyes that he would spend the next 5 years unable to forget. Not rage, which he could have withstood. Not tears, which he could have tried to address, but a clean, devastating recognition. As if a theorem she had been quietly testing had just proved itself with brutal precision. She had suspected. She had hoped she was wrong. She was not wrong. 6 breaths. He counted them without intending to, standing motionless in that corridor while she stood motionless in that doorway, the entire architecture of their year together rearranging itself in the silence between them. Then she walked away. Her steps were even. Her spine was straight. Her hands, he noticed, were perfectly still at her sides. He had not followed her. That failure was the one he would turn over in his hands for the rest of his life, examining every surface of it, unable to determine what he should have done differently, only that something should have been different. A man who could command 50,000 soldiers across a winter campaign had stood in a corridor and done nothing, while the most honest thing in his life walked away from him in the dark. Power had taught him to be decisive in every situation that mattered to the Empire. It had never taught him how to be decisive in the situations that mattered to himself. The sun was fully above the cliff line when his general, Bram, appeared in the doorway of the chamber. Bram was 60 years old, built like a siege tower left too long in the rain, weathered but structurally sound, with a face that had stopped being surprised by anything decades ago. He had served 3 generations of House Draxon. He had delivered bad news before. He took one look at Vaelor sitting in the reading chair and understood that whatever had occurred required a different approach than usual. "She's gone," Vaelor said. He didn't say it like a question. Bram was quiet for a moment. "Her chambers are cleared, not ransacked. Cleared. The way you clear a space you're not coming back to." He paused. The scholars in the Eastern Library said she returned 3 books before midnight, checked them in properly, signed the record. Vaelor almost made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Seris had returned borrowed books before she dismantled her own life. Of course she had. She had been an archivist before she was a queen, and she would be an archivist long after she was done being anyone's anything. "The bond?" Bram asked. "Gone." Another silence. Bram breathed through his nose, the slow, deliberate exhale of a man organizing what needed to be said carefully. "The council will need to be told something. Tell them she's traveling. For how long?" "Until I decide otherwise." Bram looked at him steadily. He had earned the right, across 40 years, to look at kings steadily. "Vaelor, the Empire watches the royal bond the way wolves watch weather. They'll feel the fracture within days, if they haven't already." "I know what the Empire watches." His voice came out flat, stripped of its usual authority, carrying only the residue of something used up. "Give me the morning, Bram." The old general studied him with the particular expression of someone calculating how much truth a man could absorb before it became damage. Then he nodded once and left. Vaelor remained in the chair. He was trying to locate, somewhere inside the inventory of himself, the part that was supposed to know what to do next. The part that had always known. The mechanism that had never failed in 2 decades of rule. The cold, efficient calculation of what the situation required and how to provide it. The mechanism was still there, but for the first time in his life, the answer it returned was nothing. "Papa, you let her leave." The voice came from the doorway Bram had just vacated, and it carried a tone that Vaelor had been hearing since childhood, the particular inflection of someone who believed ownership was a synonym for love. "Celine." She stood in the frame with her dark hair pinned back and her composure arranged into what she probably believed was neutrality. She was tall, elegant, in the architectural way of women who had grown up in courts, where elegance was a survival mechanism. She and Seris shared blood through a complicated line of maternal cousins, had shared looks sometimes that Vaelor had noticed and not adequately considered. He did not turn around. "Yes," he said. She moved into the room. Her footsteps were different from Seris's, slower, more deliberate in a way that announced itself. "You should send trackers immediately, before she reaches the border territories." "I'm aware of the logistics." Then why are you sitting in her chair? He turned his head slightly, but still did not look directly at her. Get out of this room. Vaelor? That wasn't a suggestion arranged to sound like a command. He turned fully now, and whatever she saw in his face made her step backward once. Leave this room. Don't come back to this wing today. A complicated sequence of emotions moved through her expression. Hurt, calculation. Something that might have been guilt if she had fully committed to examining it. She left. He sat for another hour before he moved. When he did, he went to the war room and began coordinating the search himself. He told himself it was duty, political necessity. An alpha without his mate was an invitation to every ambitious predator in the surrounding territories, and Arkenvale could not afford that signal. He told himself that for a long time. He was not a man given to self-deception in most areas of his life, but grief, real grief, the kind that does not announce itself as grief, but simply inhabits the body as a lowered temperature, a reduced appetite, a preference for silence. Grief made philosophers out of fools and fools out of philosophers. What he was actually doing was searching for something he did not deserve to find. He was just organized enough to hide that truth from every person except the one who would have seen through it immediately. And she was already gone. The first 2 months yielded nothing. This was, in itself, informative. His trackers were the finest in the Empire, and men and women who had located fugitives across ice fields through river networks into the dense architectural confusion of allied city-states. The absence of a trail was not incompetence. It was evidence. Seris had planned this. The realization arrived one evening in the war room where maps covered every surface, and Vaelor stood at the center of them, surrounded by cartography and theory, and understood that the woman who had not left in desperation. She had left in preparation. She had been preparing, perhaps for longer than he wanted to consider, to be capable of vanishing completely if it became necessary. He had built her a palace and given her resources and granted her scholarly access across the entire Empire's archive system. She had used all of it, and she had used it to become someone capable of surviving without him. A lesser man might have found that insulting. Vaelor found it, against his own instincts, something close to respect. The cold, uncomfortable respect of someone who recognized genuine competence even when it was directed against him. He called in his spy master, a lean and perpetually unimpressed woman named Corva, who had been gathering information for House Draxon since before Vaelor's father died. North, he said. Corva looked at him without blinking. The northern reaches are sovereign territory, Sorin Valicrest's jurisdiction. I know whose jurisdiction it is. Then you know that sending trackers across that line without diplomatic clearance constitutes an act of political provocation. She let that sit in the room for a beat. Unless you intend to make it an act of political provocation. Not yet. He studied the map. What do we know about Valicrest's current relationships with the scholarly networks? Corva's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The micro-movement of someone connecting points they had not previously connected. He's expanded his archive infrastructure significantly over the past 3 years, brought in specialists from 4 different regions, linguistic scholars, blood law experts, treaty historians. A pause that carried weight. He's been building something that looks less like a library and more like a governing institution. And the specialists, Vaelor said. Do we have names? I'll need time to compile. Take a week. 3 days, she said, because Corva had never been able to resist demonstrating that her estimates were always conservative. She left with the particular efficiency of someone who was already working. Vaelor stood alone over the maps. Sorin Valicrest. He knew the Northern King by reputation rather than proximity. Their territories shared a border that had been diplomatically maintained through mutual disinterest. Sorin was the kind of ruler who made no dramatic gestures, issued no declarations of strength, attended no ceremonies that weren't worth attending. His army was smaller than Vaelor's. His territory was harsher. His reputation was, frustratingly, impeccable. He listened, the report said. He listened before he decided anything. Vaelor had always found that characteristic either admirable or threatening, depending on the day. Tonight it felt like both. He pressed 2 fingers against the northern border on the map. Wherever she was, she had chosen somewhere she would not be retrieved easily. She had considered, with the same meticulous attention she brought to ancient treaties and blood law, what a man like Vaelor would do next. and she had positioned herself accordingly. That, perhaps more than anything, was what made the guilt so precise. She hadn't run from him. She had built against him. There is a particular kind of reckoning that arrives when you understand that the person you wronged was always smarter than you treated them. It is not a comfortable reckoning. It does not permit the softer narrative in which the betrayed party collapses, in which their devastation affirms the betrayer's significance. It offers instead the brutal clarity of watching someone prove, through every move they make after leaving, that they were never as dependent on you as you assumed. Vaelor had assumed a great many things. Power makes assumptions automatic. When the world consistently reshapes itself around your decisions, you stop distinguishing between what is true and what is merely what you have decided to be true. It is the most insidious corruption, not rage, not cruelty, not the obvious violations that courts and councils can identify and address, but the slow erosion of curiosity. The gradual replacement of genuine interest in another person with the comfortable certainty that you already know everything worth knowing about them. He had governed an empire with exacting attention. He had governed his marriage like a man who believed the map was the territory. The map, it turned out, was wrong. Not. Corva returned in 2 days and 14 hours. The name she placed on the table was not Seris directly. No such documentation existed, because Seris had arrived in the Northern Territory as a scholar under credentials that were technically accurate and personally revealing only to someone who already knew what they were looking for. But Corva had looked. There's a woman in Valcrest's Eastern Archive Complex, goes by a working name in the Scholarly Registry. Language Specialist. Blood Law Reconstruction. Corva set a folded report on the table without touching it again. Her habit when delivering information she found personally significant. She arrived approximately 6 weeks after the Queen's departure from this palace. The timing is consistent. The scholarly profile is exact. You're certain. I'm rarely certain. I'm currently close enough that I'd stake my professional reputation on it. Vaelor looked at the report without opening it. And Valcrest? Does he know who she is? That's harder to determine. Corva's expression was measured. He granted sanctuary to a scholar. Whether he knows he granted sanctuary to the Alpha Queen of House Draxen is a different question. What I can tell you is that his security arrangements around the archive complex are considerably tighter than they were 6 months ago. Vaelor absorbed this. He knows. Or suspects. Either way, he's protecting her. The war room was quiet except for the sound of wind against the exterior walls and the distant, rhythmic step of the wall guard outside. Vaelor stood with his hands flat on the map and stared at the northern border and did the calculation that every ruler in his position eventually had to make, the one between what you had the right to do and what you had the right to do. He had the military power to make a formal claim through diplomatic channels. He had the political authority to escalate through treaty law. He had, technically, every instrument of state available to him. He had none of the moral authority required to use any of them. Stand down the trackers, he said. Corva didn't react, which meant she'd anticipated this. And the diplomatic channels? Nothing yet. The council is beginning to ask direct questions about the Queen's absence. The council can ask them to me. And what will you tell them? He looked up from the map. That I'm handling it. Corva studied him with the expression she reserved for situations where she believed someone was making a choice that would have long consequences. She had served kings long enough to recognize the specific weight of decisions made from guilt rather than strategy. For what it's worth, she said, which was how Corva prefaced the rare moments when she offered something outside the purely informational, Valcrest's protection is genuine, not political. Men who offer political protection communicate it. He isn't communicating anything. I know, Vaelor said. That tells you something about the kind of man he is. It tells me several things. None of them comfortable. Months folded into months. Winter came again over Arkenvale with the impersonal efficiency of seasons that have no interest in the politics of those who endure them. The obsidian towers of House Draxen were lashed by the same storms that had defined every winter Vaelor could remember, and the palace continued its operations with the momentum of an institution too large and too old to register the emotional state of any single person within it, including its king. He ruled, He ruled with the same precision and the same cold authority that had built the empire's reputation across 2 decades. Borders were maintained, trade agreements were negotiated. 3 separate uprisings in the outer territories were suppressed before they became wars. A drought in the southern reaches required emergency redistribution of grain reserves, which he coordinated personally across 6 weeks of 17-hour days. He was, by every external measure, exactly what an alpha king was supposed to be. The internal measure was something he stopped taking. Some accounting is too accurate to be useful. Selene attempted twice during those months to reconstitute something in the space that Seris had vacated. The first attempt was gentle, proximity, presence, the quiet language of someone who believed that time and proximity were sufficient to rewrite a narrative. Vaelor ended it with the same flat directness he brought to military situations. Clearly, without cruelty, without room for reinterpretation. Whatever you believed this was, he told her, in the empty corridor outside the council chamber. It's finished. I don't say that as punishment. I say it because you deserve the accuracy. She had looked at him for a long moment, something in her expression that he couldn't fully read, not because he wasn't paying attention, but because guilt alters perception, makes even legitimate interactions feel contaminated. You loved her, Selene said. It wasn't quite an accusation. Yes, more than you. She stopped herself. More than I understood until I understood it too late. He met her eyes. That isn't something I'm able to reverse, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this conversation easier. She left. The second attempt never fully materialized. He was grateful for that, at least. Bram, in the way of men who had lived long enough to watch patterns repeat across generations, said nothing directly about any of it. He simply remained, steady, present, professionally loyal in the particular way that transcends employment and becomes something closer to witness. On the worst nights, when the palace was quiet and Vaelor sat in the war room past midnight with reports spread across the table, and his mind somewhere north of the border, Bram would appear in the doorway with 2 cups and sit down across from him without asking permission. They rarely spoke during those sessions. They didn't need to. There is a specific kind of friendship that exists between men who have stood in enough difficult places together that words have become largely redundant. Bram had been present at every significant moment of Vaelor's adult life. His coronation, his father's death, 3 major wars, a dozen smaller ones, the political crisis that had nearly fractured the empire 12 years ago. He had watched Vaelor make hard decisions without flinching, and had watched him make wrong ones without commentary. Now he watched a king sit with the weight of his own failure and offered the only thing that was genuinely useful, presence without judgment. You're going north, Bram said one evening at the end of the second winter. Not a question. Vaelor looked up. Eventually. Sooner or later becomes now. The old general set down his cup. Whatever you're waiting for, some moment where you feel ready, some shift that makes the approach feel less like exposure, that moment isn't coming. I've lived 60 years and I'll tell you plainly, readiness is a story we tell ourselves to postpone the things we're afraid of. Vaelor was quiet. You aren't afraid of much, Bram continued. I've watched you walk into situations that would have broken other men without so much as adjusting your expression. But this. He gestured vaguely at the space around them, at the palace, at the northern border, invisible beyond the walls. This has you waiting like a man who isn't sure the ice will hold his weight. It might not. Probably won't. Bram picked up his cup again. Go anyway. Vaelor did not go immediately. He waited another 4 months. Not from cowardice, exactly. From something more complicated. The particular paralysis of a man who had spent 2 years reconstructing himself and was not yet certain the reconstruction was complete enough to be honest in front of the person who had known the original. He worked on the empire. He worked on himself with the same methodical attention he brought to state policy, examining the specific failures that had produced this outcome, not in the self-flagellating way that substitutes suffering for change, but in the cold, investigative manner of someone who needed accurate information before they could address root causes. He sought out advisors he had previously dismissed as too slow, too deliberate, too inclined to complicate efficient decisions with nuance. He listened. It was harder than he expected. Listening, real listening, the kind that receives information without immediately processing it through the filter of what you've already decided, was a discipline that went against every instinct power had built in him. Power rewards rapid decision-making. It rewards certainty. It penalizes hesitation and ambiguity and the slow, uncomfortable work of genuinely understanding something before acting on it. He made himself hesitate. He made himself sit in ambiguity. He was, at 53 years old, learning to be a student of his own worst qualities. It was the most exhausting campaign of his life. And then, in the third spring, his scouts brought him information that did not arrive through Corva's intelligence channels. It arrived through the blood. An alpha's instincts operate at a level below language, below strategy, below the careful reasoning that builds empires and maintains them. They are ancient, unreliable, and occasionally inexplicably accurate. His had been largely silent since the bond was severed, a dormant system conserving its own resources in the absence of its primary connection. But in the third spring, without warning, without external trigger, something in the accumulated data of his instincts reassembled itself into a signal so clear it woke him from sleep at the third hour of morning. He sat up in the dark. He stayed there for a long time, testing what he was receiving against every rational objection available. Then he went to find Corva. She was already awake, which was either coincidental or evidence that she simply never slept. She looked at him across her desk with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific conversation. "Tell me," he said, "what you know about the Northern Archive complex, specifically current population, recent additions." Corva opened a drawer and removed a file. She set it on the desk. She did not open it. "I've been sitting on this for 3 weeks," she said. "I was waiting to determine whether it was relevant to your plans or simply to your suffering." "What is it?" "Information." She looked at him steadily. "The kind that changes the mathematics of every decision you make from this point forward." He opened the file. He read it. The room was absolutely silent. Vaelor looked at the information in the file for a long time. Not because it was complicated, but because what was simple and what was devastating were, in this case, exactly the same thing. He read the single piece of intelligence that Corva had gathered through 3 weeks of careful, distant, carefully anonymous inquiry into the personnel records of the Northern Archive complex, and he understood in the space of a moment that everything he thought he was calculating, every timeline, every approach, every reconstruction of himself he had been so carefully undertaking had been built on an incomplete foundation. He had not known what he was missing. He knew now. He set the file down. His hands, which had not trembled in 20 years, were not entirely steady. "How certain are you?" he said, his voice carrying a flatness that was not calm, but was what happened when emotion exceeded the capacity of any available register. "About this." Corva looked at him without blinking. "Certain enough," she said, "that I sat on it for 3 weeks before I showed you." He stood up. He walked to the window. The northern border was out there somewhere beyond the pre-dawn dark, beyond the cliffs and the forests and the sovereign territory of a king who had offered sanctuary to the woman who had taken the piece of him that he had not understood was essential until it was already gone. The woman who had not only built a life without him, but who had, in the silence of that building, kept a secret that altered the entire geography of everything. Outside, the first light was beginning to find the edges of the world. Vaelor stood at the window and breathed in and out against what he now knew. 2 sons, silver-eyed, already 3 years old, and she had not told him a single word. The file sat on Corva's desk like a wound that had stopped bleeding but hadn't closed. Vaelor did not move from the window for a long time. The pre-dawn sky above Arkenvale was doing what skies do regardless of what happens beneath them, lightening incrementally, indifferently, with the mechanical patience of things that have never needed anyone's permission to continue. He watched it without seeing it. His mind was doing the specific kind of work that has no name in any language because it happens below language. The re-architecture of every assumption, every calculation, every version of the past 3 years that he had been operating inside. 2 sons. He said it internally, not as information being processed, but as something being measured against the available capacity to contain it. A man can know a fact and still spend several minutes determining whether he is actually large enough to hold it. He was not entirely sure he was. "How did you find them?" he said, not accusatory, just needing the sequence. Corva leaned back in her chair, the old wood creaking once. Archive registration records. The Northern System cross-indexes scholarly personnel with residential dependents for resource allocation purposes. Housing, food distribution, educational access. She paused. She registered them under a variant spelling of her working name. Enough distance to avoid casual identification, not enough to survive a thorough search by someone who already knew what they were looking for. You knew what you were looking for. I knew what the timing suggested was possible. I looked. Another pause. Briefer. I almost didn't tell you. He turned from the window. That was not something Corva said lightly. In 20 years of service, she had delivered intelligence with the clinical neutrality of a physician delivering test results, present, accurate, professionally uninvested in the recipient's reaction. Why tell me at all? He asked. She met his eyes directly. Because you're going north regardless. You've been going north for 2 years in every sense except the physical one. And a man walking into that situation without complete information is a man who makes decisions that can't be unmade. She picked up her cup, which had gone cold, and set it back down without drinking. The boys are real. They exist. Whatever happens next happens around that fact. You needed to know it before you arrived, not after. Vaelor absorbed this. Their names, he said. Corva looked at him steadily for a moment, something in her expression that he rarely saw. Not softness exactly, but the recognition of weight. Cassian, Elir. He repeated them internally. He felt the names find their places in him like keys finding locks that had existed without context. Silver eyes, Corva said quietly. Both of them. He turned back to the window. The sky was fully light now. The Empire was waking. Somewhere in the palace below, the machinery of governance was initiating its daily operations. Councils convening, correspondence being sorted, the 1,000 small decisions that kept an empire from fracturing, requiring the continuous attention of the people responsible for them. He had never in 20 years walked away from that machinery before it needed him. Tell Bram to prepare a delegation, he said. Small, 12 riders. No military insignia beyond the standard diplomatic markers. When do you want to depart? 4 days. The council will want to know your destination. Tell them I'm conducting a border assessment. They won't believe that. They'll accept it. He looked at her over his shoulder. Prepare everything through back channels. I don't want anyone in that northern palace to have more than 48 hours of warning before we arrive. Corva nodded once. Then she said, with the precision of someone who had been choosing the right moment for a specific question, What are you planning to do when you get there? Vaelor was quiet for long enough that the silence became an answer of its own kind. Not evasion, but the honest acknowledgement that some questions deserve more than a reflexive response. I don't know yet, he said. He meant it. For the first time in his ruling life, he was approaching a situation without a prepared position, without a strategic objective mapped to multiple contingencies, without the architecture of certainty that had defined every significant decision of his reign. He was approaching it with nothing except the approximate truth of who he was and what he had done, and the terrifying open question of whether those two things together were sufficient for whatever came next. Corva said nothing else. That was its own form of respect. The northern road in late spring was the kind of landscape that had no interest in being beautiful, but achieved it anyway. Greystone and dark pine, and the particular quality of northern light that fell without warmth across everything it touched, honest in the way of things that have never learned to flatter. Vaelor rode at the head of his small delegation and said almost nothing for 3 days. Bram rode beside him and maintained the same disciplined silence, with the occasional practical exchange required by the logistics of movement, campsite decisions, water access, the rotation of scouts along the forward positions. Nothing that wasn't operationally necessary. On the second night, camped at the edge of the border forest with fires kept deliberately small, Bram sat beside him and stared into the flames and said, without preamble, "You found out something you didn't expect." It wasn't a question. Bram had the specific intuition of men who had watched a single person long enough to read the temperature of their silence. "Yes," Vaelor said, "something that changes the approach. Everything about the approach." Bram was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to tell me?" Vaelor looked at the fire. He thought about whether telling anyone before he told Seris was appropriate, and then he recognized that judgment itself as a form of accountability he hadn't previously exercised, the instinct to consider what she was owed before considering his own need to unburden. "Not yet," he said. Bram accepted that without comment. The fire burned down. The northern forest was enormous and dark around them, full of sounds that were simply the sounds of living things going about their business in the absence of human interference. An owl somewhere to the east, wind through the upper branches, the breathing of horses. "Are you afraid?" Bram asked, eventually. Vaelor thought about lying. Old habit. An alpha's instinct to maintain the appearance of impenetrability even with the people who have long since seen through it. "Yes," he said. Bram made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific honest word. "Good," he said. "Fear means you understand the stakes." They didn't speak again until morning. Soren Valacrest's citadel arrived in view on the afternoon of the fourth day. It was not what Vaelor expected, which told him something immediate about the difference between reputation and reality. He had imagined something austere, militarized, built to communicate power through physical dominance the way Draxen Palace communicated it through height and obsidian angles. What he found instead was a structure that communicated something harder to quantify: permanence. Not the permanence of conquest, but of settlement, of deep roots. Stone that had been here longer than any living politics. Architecture that said, "We are still here not as a threat, but as a statement of plain fact." The gates were open. A steward met them at the outer wall, young, composed, carrying the specific kind of neutral courtesy that comes from working for a ruler who values measured responses. "King Vaelor of House Draxen," the steward said, without surprise, which confirmed that Corva's 48-hour estimate had been approximately correct. "King Soren extends his welcome. He'll receive you this evening. And the rest of my delegation? Comfortable quarters have been prepared. Your horses will be taken care of." Vaelor noted the absence of the specific formal language that usually accompanied diplomatic reception, the elaborate courtesy phrases that functioned less as hospitality and more as territorial signaling. Soren's people simply said what was happening and left room for him to respond. He found it disorienting in a way he didn't immediately have words for. He was shown to chambers that were comfortable without being ostentatious. A fire already burning, water ready, the practical essentials of hosting handled with efficiency and without theatrical gesture. He changed out of the road-worn clothing and stood at the window of his temporary room and looked out at the citadel's interior courtyard. There was an archive building on the eastern side of the courtyard. He knew this because Corva had described the layout. He had not expected to be able to see it from his window, which felt either like deliberate arrangement or the universe's blunt sense of narrative convenience. The building was long, low, built with large windows to maximize northern light for reading. From his position, he could see people moving inside. Scholars, presumably bent over tables, moving between shelves, carrying the particular industry of people engaged in work they have chosen rather than been assigned. He stood there for a long time. He did not go to the window more than twice. He was practicing, deliberately, the discipline he had been building for 2 years, the restraint that distinguishes a man who has genuinely changed from a man who has simply learned to perform change in more sophisticated ways. The old Vaelor would have located her immediately, would have arranged, through whatever means available, to be in her sightline before any formal meeting could establish terms, would have used proximity as leverage before leverage was supposed to be available. He stayed in his room. He stared at the fire. He thought about Cassian and Elir, whose names he had been saying quietly to himself for 4 days without anyone else hearing. Soren received him in a room that was clearly a working space rather than a reception hall. A long table covered in actual papers, an actual fire that needed tending and had not been tended for an hour judging by its current state, 2 chairs that did not match and had not been replaced because no one had prioritized the aesthetic inconsistency over functional comfort. Soren himself was standing when Vaelor entered, which in the diplomatic grammar of rulers usually signaled either genuine welcome or the tactical choice to greet on equal footing rather than from a position of seated authority. Vaelor evaluated it in half a second and suspended his evaluation. He had promised himself he would try, in this specific place, to take things at something closer to face value. Soren was younger than Vaelor by perhaps 8 years, 40-something, lean in the particular way of men who live hard winters without making a performance of enduring them, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes that were doing exactly what Corva's reports had suggested they would do. Measuring. Not aggressively. Not even with visible suspicion. Simply with the attentiveness of someone who believes that looking carefully at a thing before deciding what it is represents the minimum reasonable standard of intelligence. Vaelor, he said, no title. Not dismissive, simply the directness of a man who had decided that in this specific conversation, the formalities were a delay neither of them needed. Soren, Vaelor matched it. They sat. A brief silence settled between them, the particular quiet of two men who are each, in their own way, trying to determine how much of what they actually think to say out loud. Soren said, I expected you sooner. I wasn't ready sooner. Something shifted in Soren's expression, small but real. He hadn't expected that answer. Most kings, arriving under these circumstances, would have offered a strategic explanation, a political framing, not the plain statement that they had needed time to become capable of being here without doing damage. What changed? Soren asked. Information, Vaelor said. Then, and 3 years of attempting to become someone who could be told the truth without weaponizing it. Soren looked at him for a long moment. He had a way of looking at things. People, problems, rooms. That was thorough without being aggressive. The look of someone who has learned that patience and observation is usually cheaper than speed and misunderstanding. She doesn't know you're here yet, Soren said. I assumed. I could tell her before your meeting tomorrow. That's your decision to make, not mine. Vaelor paused. I'd suggest telling her tonight. She'll be less, he searched for the right word, ambushed. She deserves the ambush less than I deserve whatever she does with it. Soren's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in recalibration. He was updating something. You've changed, he said. I've tried. Vaelor's voice was flat, not with indifference, but with the specific weight of a statement that has been tested enough times that performance has been fully extracted from it. Whether the changes are sufficient is not something I'm in a position to judge. No, Soren agreed quietly. It isn't. Another silence. This one was different, less evaluative, more like two people who have arrived at the same coordinate from different directions and are momentarily just occupying the same space. The boys, Vaelor said. Soren went still. It was a different kind of still from before. Not the stillness of thinking, but the stillness of a man who has just heard a specific word in a specific context and is now making rapid decisions about what that means. You know, Soren said, 3 weeks ago. Intelligence channels. Yes. Soren looked at the fire, something in his expression that Vaelor could not entirely read, not quite anger, not quite resignation. She's going to need to know that you knew before you arrived, not finding out mid-conversation. I agree. If you use them. Soren stopped, began again, with the precision of a man choosing words that carry exact weight. If you use the fact of their existence as any kind of leverage in whatever you think this conversation is going to accomplish, I will personally escort your delegation back across the border. Vaelor looked at him. I know. I'm not asking if you understand the consequence. I'm telling you I'll do it. I heard you. Vaelor held his gaze without flinching. I'm not here to claim anything through leverage. If I wanted to do that, I could have done it 2 years ago through diplomatic treaty, and I chose not to. He paused. I'm here because I owe her a conversation. That's the only thing I'm here for. Soren studied him. The fire crackled. Outside, the citadel was settling into evening. The soft diminishment of operational noise that comes when the working day completes itself and the quieter rhythms of private hours begin. I'll tell her tonight, Soren said. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm not doing it for you. I know that too. Soren stood, which was the signal that the meeting was complete. He offered his hand, not the elaborate formal exchange of diplomatic greeting, but the simpler gesture of two men who have determined that whatever else they are to each other, they are at minimum being honest with each other in this room. Vaelor took it. One more thing, Soren said before releasing his hand. She's not who she was when she left your palace. Whatever expectation you arrived with, adjust it now. The woman in my archive is one of the finest legal minds in any territory I've encountered. She has built something real here, and this is the part that matters most. She is content. The word landed differently than Soren probably intended. Content. Not happy in the performed way of people who have been told to be happy. Content in the specific, substantive way of someone who has located the actual shape of their own life and settled into it without apology. Vaelor felt something in his chest that was not pain, but was in the same neighborhood. Good, he said, and meant it in the complicated way that good can mean multiple things simultaneously. Relief that she had built something solid, grief that the building had required her to leave, and the specific quality of love that wishes for someone's well-being even when that well-being was constructed in your absence. Soren let go of his hand. Vaelor went back to his room. He didn't sleep much. She was already in the archive when he arrived the next morning. Soren had arranged the meeting in a small chamber off the main reading hall, a room with a work table, 2 chairs, and enough space that no one would feel cornered. Practical, thoughtful. The arrangement of someone who understood that the physical environment of a difficult conversation matters more than people acknowledge. She was standing when he entered, not because she had been waiting nervously. He could tell by the document in her hand, which she had clearly been reading until the moment the door opened, that she had been working until the last possible second. The specific discipline of someone who has learned to keep their hands busy when their mind is threatened with excess stillness. She looked at him. He had not adequately prepared for this. He had prepared for her anger, for her composure, for the formal distance of a woman who had long since processed this situation into something manageable. He had prepared, in the abstract, for the physical fact of seeing her again after 3 years. He had not prepared for the specific reality that she looked like herself, unmistakably, entirely herself, in a way that was somehow more vivid than his memory had managed. The memory had preserved her accurately in all the technical details. What it had failed to capture was the quality of presence, the way she occupied space with a completeness that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with having located precisely where she was supposed to be. She had found that quality here. He could see it, and he could see what it cost him to see it. Vaelor, she said. Her voice was steady, not warm, not hostile, present, unafraid. Seris. He stopped just inside the door. Thank you for agreeing to this. I agreed because Soren thought I should, and I've learned to take his judgment seriously. A beat. Also because I was curious whether you were actually different or whether you'd learned to perform different more convincingly. He almost smiled at that. Not from amusement, but from recognition. She was exactly the same in the specific ways that mattered. Direct, precise, unwilling to frame anything in softer language just because the softer language would make the room more comfortable. I don't know which one I am yet, he said. Genuinely. She studied him. Sit down, she said. This is going to take a while. He sat. She remained standing for a moment, something internal being decided, and then she sat too. The document she'd been holding was set aside without being put down entirely, a detail that told him she hadn't decided yet whether this meeting was going to conclude before she needed to return to it. You know about the boys, she said. 3 weeks ago. Something crossed her face, not quite surprised because Soren had told her, but a recalibration of the timeline she'd been operating with. How? Archive registration records. My spy master is thorough. Corva. She said the name with the flat recognition of someone who had always known this was a possible vector. I wondered whether the variant spelling would hold. For a long time it did. But not forever. Nothing does, he said. And then, because she deserved the accuracy, I chose not to act on the information immediately. I spent 3 weeks determining whether I was in any condition to be told it without the response being catastrophic. She looked at him. And? I'm here. I'm sitting in a chair instead of standing in a doorway making demands. He met her eyes. That's the best assessment I have. A silence moved between them, different from the silences of 3 years ago. Not the silence of 2 people who have reached the limit of their shared language, but the silence of two people who are being very careful because they understand that what is said next will have real consequence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. Not aggressively. He had promised himself he would not frame this as accusation. He was asking because he needed to understand, not because understanding was something he was entitled to extract. She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and direct and contained the specific patience of someone who has rehearsed this question without rehearsing a performance of the answer. "Because a crown rarely asks what love needs," she said. "It asks what authority can claim." She let that sit. "I didn't know which one you would be. I was reasonably confident, based on available evidence, that you would be the second. You could have been wrong." "Yes." No apology in the word. Simple acknowledgement. "I could have been wrong. And if I'd been wrong in the direction of telling you, I would have handed you the single most effective tool for removing my ability to choose anything about my own life." Her voice was even. Two heirs of House Draxon, born outside the Empire's territory without a legally recognized bond, that's not a personal situation, Vaelor. That's a political crisis that every faction in your council could exploit in 12 different directions. I would have become a function of the crisis rather than a person with choices. He was quiet, because she was right. Not partially right. Fully, accurately, with the precision of a blood law scholar who had studied exactly what would have happened. Right. "Yes," he said. She blinked once, slowly. "Yes, what?" "You were right about what I would have done." He held her gaze. "I would have done exactly what you were afraid I would do. I would have framed it as duty, as necessity, as the Empire requiring stability. And I would have believed every word of it, which would have made it worse." He paused. "I'm not saying that to perform honesty. I'm saying it because I've spent a significant amount of time over the past 3 years being accurate about the specific ways I failed you, and that is one of them." She looked at him for a long time. Something shifted in the room, subtle, like pressure changing before weather. "What do you want from this conversation?" she said. "Nothing I can take." He chose the words deliberately. "I came to tell you that I understand what happened, and I understand my part in it. I came to meet my sons, if and when you decide that's appropriate, and not before. And I came to offer whatever form of accountability is actually useful to you, not the form that makes me feel better about what I did." She was very still. "That's different," she said. "I know. From what you were." "Yes." She stood up. Not from anger. He recognized the motion as her way of thinking, pacing in small circuits when the thoughts needed physical expression. She moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard and was quiet for long enough that he didn't try to fill it. "Cassian will want to know who you are," she said finally, her back to him. "He asks about his father. Not every day, but he asks. He's curious about everything, and he doesn't stop asking questions until he gets an answer that actually addresses what he was asking, which is apparently..." A pause that might have contained something complicated. "A quality he got from somewhere." Vaelor said nothing. "Elir doesn't ask," she continued. "He watches, he waits. He stores information and waits until he understands what to do with it." She turned from the window. "He's 3 years old and already the most patient person I've ever spent time with, which is..." She stopped. The sentence went unfinished, but he heard its shape clearly. "Which is like you. Not as compliment, not as condemnation, as the complicated factual acknowledgement that some things transmit regardless of presence, that children carry forward what they're made of even when the people who made them have been absent. I'm not asking to be part of their lives," he said carefully. "I'm telling you I want to be. Those are different statements. One is a claim, the other is a position you can respond to however you need to. And if I say no, then I go home and I find another way to be accountable that doesn't require access to them." She looked at him steadily. "You'd accept that." "I would not enjoy it." He held her gaze. "But enjoyment isn't the standard I'm operating from anymore." The room was quiet again. Outside, somewhere across the courtyard, a child's voice carried briefly on the spring air, high, clear, asking something that the distance made inaudible. Just the shape of a question without the content. Both of them heard it. Neither of them said anything about it. "Why Celine?" Seris said. Not as accusation, as the question she had been carrying for 3 years beneath all the other questions. the one that didn't have a strategic dimension or a political dimension, but was simply the human wound underneath everything else. Vaelor looked at his hands for a moment. "Because she was there," he said, "and because I was arrogant enough to believe that proximity was something I could manage without it becoming damage." He looked up. "And because I didn't treat our marriage as something real enough to protect. I treated it as an arrangement that was working, which is a different thing entirely. And I didn't understand the difference until the difference had already cost me everything worth having." She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before. Not from her, not in a year of living beside her. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the expression of someone who has been given an accurate answer to a question they asked genuinely, and is now holding that accuracy and deciding what to do with its weight. "I'm not going to forgive you today," she said. "I'm not asking you to." "Good." She moved back to her chair. "Because forgiveness isn't a thing I'm prepared to manufacture on a timeline that makes this easier for you. If it comes, it'll come because it's real, not because you said the right things." "That's the only way it would mean anything," he said. She picked up her document. The gesture was clear. The conversation had reached its natural boundary for today. He stood. He moved toward the door and then stopped, one hand on the frame, and said the thing he had been carrying since before he left Arkan Vale, the thing that existed underneath every strategic consideration and every practiced accountability and every careful formulation of what he was and wasn't asking for. "They have my eyes," he said. "Silver." He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to. "Yes," she said. Her voice was careful. "They do." He left. He walked through the archive hall without looking at the other scholars, out through the main doors into the spring courtyard, into the light that fell across the stone with that particular northern honesty, bright but not warm, clear but not flattering. He stopped in the middle of the courtyard. Bram was standing near the eastern wall with 2 cups because Bram had apparently stationed himself in a position of visual contact with the archive entrance and had been waiting. He crossed the courtyard and handed Vaelor a cup without speaking. Vaelor took it. They stood side by side in the spring light. "How'd it go?" Bram said. "Eventually." "Honestly," Vaelor drank. The coffee was bitter and hot and real. "She's going to think about whether she allows me to meet them. And if she doesn't, then I figure out what kind of man I'm going to be about that." Bram nodded slowly. "That's growth." "It's the minimum standard," Vaelor said. "It's not growth, it's just basic." Bram drank his coffee. Somewhere across the courtyard, behind the archive building, children's voices had started up again. Louder now, 2 of them. An argument of the specific passionate brevity that children bring to disagreements about things that are extremely important and also entirely mundane. The argument resolved itself in approximately 30 seconds into what sounded like a cooperative project of some kind, both voices now focused in the same direction. Vaelor did not move toward the sound. He stood exactly where he was. He had promised himself he would not maneuver, would not position himself in the architecture of coincidental proximity, would not allow the controlled accident that the old Vaelor would have engineered without conscious thought, the approach disguised as happenstance that power makes reflexive. He stood in the middle of the courtyard and drank his coffee and did nothing, which was, for a man like him, one of the harder things he had done. And then the eastern door of the archive building opened. Seris came through it first, carrying a stack of documents, walking with the purposeful stride of someone moving between tasks. She did not look at him immediately. She was talking to a young scholar who was scribbling something as they walked, clearly taking notes on something she was saying, and she was focused on the task in the complete way that had always been one of the most characteristic things about her. Behind her, 2 boys spilled through the door in the haphazard way of children who have been doing something indoor and are now released into the outdoors and are determining with considerable urgency what to do with this new freedom. They were... He could not finish the thought. They were real, was the thing. 3 years old and entirely, overwhelmingly real, in the way that even the most accurate intelligence report cannot prepare you for because a report is information, and these were people. Distinct, individual, already themselves. Cassian was running, laughing at something only he found funny. Elir was walking with a specific, careful attention to the ground, tracking something. An insect, a shadow, something that warranted investigation. Cassian looked up first. Children have no diplomatic protocol, no strategic pauses, no awareness of the architectural complexity of the moment they're walking into. He looked directly at Vaelor with the frank, total curiosity of a 3-year-old encountering something he has not categorized yet. "Who are you?" he said. The courtyard was very quiet. Seris had stopped walking. She was looking at Vaelor with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Not exactly panic, not exactly resignation, not exactly the thing he feared most, which was hatred. Something more complicated. The expression of a woman watching an inevitable moment arrive earlier than she had calculated and making immediate decisions about how to respond to its arrival. Vaelor had stopped too. He was not asking questions. He was watching, storing. Vaelor looked at the boy who had asked him. He thought about every answer available. He thought about the ones that were true and the ones that were easier and the ones that were strategically sound. He thought about what Seris needed from this moment versus what he needed from it, and he understood clearly that those were not the same thing. He thought about what kind of man he was going to be. And in the moment before he answered, in the half-second that contained everything, Vaelor, who had been watching in silence, raised his eyes from the ground and looked at Vaelor with eyes that were the precise silver color of every mirror Vaelor had looked into for 53 years. The recognition was not intellectual. It was animal. It was the specific signal that travels below thought, below language, below every careful construction a person builds to manage the gap between what they feel and what they're prepared to feel. It hit him like a blade that had been falling from a great height. Cassian started, already turning to ask his mother for the categorization he needed. "Cassian," Seris said. Her voice was even. Her eyes were on Vaelor. "Come here." The boy went to her immediately, still watching Vaelor with the frank curiosity that hadn't resolved into anything yet, that was waiting for someone to give it the information it needed to become a complete thought. And in that courtyard, in the spring light, with 2 silver-eyed children standing 10 feet from him, and a woman who had survived him watching him with the controlled attention of someone holding something extremely fragile and extremely heavy, Vaelor understood that there was no version of this moment that led back to any world that had existed before it. He was here. They were real. And whatever he said next was going to be the first word of a story that would outlast every empire he had ever built. He opened his mouth. The word came out of him before strategy could intercept it. "A visitor," he said. It was the most honest word available. Not a lie, not the full truth, positioned precisely in the space between them where neither damage could be done nor false promise made. He said it with the even tone of someone who has decided in real time that the only way through this particular moment is straight ahead and at a pace the situation can absorb. Cassian processed this with the rapid, unsatisfied assessment of a child whose threshold for adequate answers was clearly calibrated high. "A visitor from where?" "The South." "What's in the South?" "Cassian?" Seris's voice was quiet, but carried the specific frequency that mothers develop for moments requiring immediate compliance without public negotiation. The boy stopped. Not reluctantly, he simply recognized the register and responded to it the way children respond to things they've learned are non-negotiable. Vaelor had not moved. He was still looking at Vaelor with those silver eyes that did not blink as often as they should have, watching with the patient intensity of someone who had not yet decided what to do with what he was seeing, but had already decided he was going to see all of it. Vaelor held his gaze. There is a specific experience, available only to people who have done genuinely serious damage in their lives, of looking at the consequence of that damage in its most innocent form. It is not punishment in any legal sense. It is not designed to produce a particular outcome. It is simply the universe presenting evidence with the neutral thoroughness of a judge who has no interest in theatrical delivery. Here is what happened. Here is what it became. Here is what you are standing in front of now. Decide accordingly, Vaelor decided. He looked away from Vaelor and back to Seris and said simply, "I'll be here when you're ready to continue." She nodded once, short, controlled. She steered both boys back toward the archive with the practiced ease of someone who has been managing their energy and their questions for 3 years alone, and the door closed behind them, and the courtyard was quiet again. Bram, who had watched all of this without moving, exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said, Not a word, Vaelor said. Bram drank his coffee. The council's messenger arrived on the 5th day. This was where the story stopped being about two people and a complicated history and became something considerably larger and considerably less forgiving. The rider came in through Soren's outer gate at dawn, bearing Vaelor's council insignia and the specific urgency of someone who had been pushing horses hard for 4 days. Vaelor was already in the eastern courtyard when the man dismounted. Old soldier's instinct, the kind that pulls you upright before you've consciously registered the sound of fast hoofbeats on stone. The messenger's name was Fen. He was young, capable, chosen for long-distance communication because he was reliable, and because he understood that his function was to transmit information with accuracy and not to editorialize. He handed Vaelor the sealed document with the dust of 4 days' hard writing still on his face and said nothing beyond the formal delivery acknowledgement. Vaelor broke the seal. He read it. He read it a second time. The second reading was not because the words were unclear. It was because the first reading had produced a response so total and so cold that the rational part of him needed confirmation before it would authorize what came next. What came next was nothing visible. That was the most frightening thing to anyone watching who knew what to look for. An ordinary man encountering the contents of that document might have made some sound, some physical expression of the shock moving through him. Vaelor stood completely still. His face settled into an absence of expression so absolute it was its own kind of statement. The specific blankness of a man whose internal systems have rerouted all available resources to processing, leaving nothing left over for performance. He folded the document. He put it inside his coat. He looked at Fen and said, "Water and food for yourself and the horses. Rest 4 hours, then be prepared to ride." "Sir?" Fen went. Bram was already crossing the courtyard. "Tell me," Bram said, low, direct. "Not here." Vaelor walked toward the Citadel's western wing, away from the archive building, away from any window where the people who needed to be protected from this information for a few more hours might be within range of their conversation. He found a storage room, practical, empty, deliberately unglamorous, the kind of space that does not appear on diplomatic itineraries. He closed the door. He told Bram what the document said. Bram was quiet for 10 full seconds after hearing it. That was the longest Vaelor had ever seen him be quiet. "Aldrich," Bram said finally. The name came out flat, stripped of everything except the brutal fact of it. "Leading it," Vaelor confirmed. "Lord Aldrich. Senior council member, 22 years in service to House Draxon, the man who had drafted half the legal infrastructure of the Empire's current governance structure, and who had been, until approximately 4 days ago, someone Vaelor would have placed in the category of political bedrock. Difficult, conservative, occasionally obstructionist, but fundamentally oriented toward the Empire's stability. The document in Vaelor's coat said otherwise. What the document said, assembled from 3 separate intelligence sources that Corva had been developing for months and had cross-verified before sending, was that Aldrich had spent the past 8 months in systematic contact with 3 of the Empire's border lords, 2 rival territorial rulers outside Arkan Vale, and this was the piece that made the cold in Vaelor's chest into something structural, Selene. The picture it constructed was not ambiguous. A succession plan, built quietly, over months, with the patience of someone who had learned patience from watching a king exercise it. It did not require violence, not immediately. It required only that Vaelor be sufficiently destabilized, a king absent from his own capital for diplomatic purposes, a queen who had severed the royal bond and vanished, twin heirs existing outside the Empire's legal framework in foreign territory, unrecognized. A council that had been asking direct questions for 3 years and receiving indirect answers, all of it adding up, in Aldrich's calculation, to a throne that was ready to be reshaped. The specific nature of the reshaping involved Selene, the twin heirs as legal claims rather than people, and a governance structure that would reduce the Alpha King to a ceremonial function while the actual authority migrated to the council structure Aldrich had spent 2 decades building. It was, Vaelor had to acknowledge, with the grim respect of one strategist recognizing another's work, not a poorly constructed plan. It was, in fact, quite good. "How much time?" Bram said. "Corva estimates the formal move within 3 weeks. They're waiting for me to return with either the heirs secured or without. Both outcomes serve the plan. If I return with the boys as recognized heirs, Aldrich has the legal machinery ready to absorb them into the succession framework before I can prevent it. If I return without them, the destabilization argument becomes stronger and the council pressure intensifies. And if you don't return at all, then I've abandoned the throne and the succession crisis is immediate. Bram breathed through his nose, the slow, contained exhale of a man organizing problems by priority. Celine, he said, just the name, as a complete statement. Yes. She fed them information about the heirs. Someone did. The timeline in Corva's report places their knowledge of the twins approximately 6 weeks after Corva located them. Someone with access to my intelligence channels communicated outward. He paused. Celine had proximity. She had motivation. And she had, based on what I know of her character, the specific blend of genuine grievance and willing political instrumentalization that makes a person useful to someone like Aldrich. Bram looked at him. She was used, and willing to be. Vaelor kept his voice even. The combination is the most dangerous kind. People who are purely cynical or predictable. People who genuinely believe their grievance justifies the instrument they've allowed themselves to become. He stopped. They don't see the architecture they're inside until it's too late to leave it. The storage room was very quiet. Outside, the Citadel was conducting its morning operations. Somewhere across the courtyard, on the other side of the archive building, 2 children were probably already awake and already asking questions and already being the specific kind of complicated, necessary, irreplaceable reality that made everything else harder and everything else more worth getting right. What do you need to do? Bram said. I need to tell Seris. Bram looked at him steadily. That's going to complicate whatever progress you've made. Yes. Vaelor pulled the document from his coat. It's also the only thing that respects the fact that her children are now at the center of an imperial succession crisis she didn't create and wasn't warned about. She'll think you brought this with you. She might. He folded the document again. She'd be wrong. But I can't control what she thinks. I can control whether I tell her before she finds out another way. There was a long moment where neither of them said anything. This is the territory that power never adequately maps. The space where being a king and being a decent human being produce directly opposing instructions. And you have to decide in real time which identity you are actually committed to inhabiting. The king's logic said, control the information, manage the timeline, secure the political position before allowing any variable you cannot predict to interact with it. The logic of basic human accountability said, she deserves to know, immediately, because she is a person and the people inside this situation matter more than your ability to manage its optics. Vaelor had spent 3 years trying to become a man for whom that choice was not actually difficult. He went to find Seris. She was in the archive. Of course she was. He had learned in a year of marriage that Seris's relationship to work was not the avoidance mechanism it was for some people, but the opposite. She went toward it when things were real, not away from it. The work was where she thought most clearly, where her mind organized itself into the structured precision that had always been its most natural state. She was alone in a small study off the main hall. The document she'd been carrying yesterday was open on the table. She looked up when he entered, and something in his face communicated information before he said a word, because she closed the document immediately and said, "What happened?" He put the report on the table. He stepped back and let her read it. Watching someone read information that changes the geometry of their world is one of the specific experiences that has no comfortable position for the observer. He could not help. He could not accelerate her processing. He could only stand there and wait while she moved through the document with the focused speed of someone who reads not linearly but architecturally, assembling the whole before confirming the parts, tracking implications before reactions. She finished. She set the document down. She was very still for about 15 seconds. "How long have you known about this?" she said. Her voice was precise, controlled, and carrying underneath the precision something that was not quite anger, but was in the same country. "Since this morning." The writer arrived at dawn. The twins. She looked at the report again, not to reread, but to confirm what she'd understood. They know about Cassian and Elir, since approximately 6 weeks after Corva located them. Which means, since before you arrived here, he recognized where she was going, and he didn't try to intercept it. Yes, the intelligence about the boys existed in my network before I came north. She looked at him. The look was doing something complex, tracking the timeline against everything he had said in their conversation yesterday, measuring whether the architecture of what he'd told her was still structurally sound or had been built over a concealed fault line. You came here knowing that your council had information about my sons, she said. Not a question, a statement being tested for accuracy. I came here because I needed to. And yes, by that point, I knew Corva's intelligence had been accessed by someone without authorization. I didn't know what had been done with it yet. He held her gaze. I should have told you that yesterday. I'm telling you now. Why not yesterday? Because I was trying to have one conversation at a time and not drown it. That, she said, is exactly the kind of calculation that got us here in the first place. The words landed with precision because they were precise. He didn't deflect them. They were accurate, and they deserved to land. Yes, he said. She stood up, moved to the window. The same motion as yesterday. Thinking in motion, working through the implications at the pace her body needed to process what her mind was already running at full speed. Celine, she said, that's Corva's assessment. She made a sound. Short, controlled, and containing inside it a specific quality of pain that was not about the political situation, but about the fact of her cousin's name appearing in this document. Whatever Celine was or wasn't, she was blood. And blood-turning instrument inside an imperial succession play had a particular quality of wound that political analysis couldn't fully account for. She was always ambitious, Seris said, not defending, acknowledging. I used to think it was just about your attention, that it was personal. She paused. I underestimated how much she understood about what your attention represented politically. So did I, Vaelor said. She turned from the window. What does Aldrich actually want? Fractional authority, the king as symbol, the council as function. It's an old governance argument. There are historical precedents. He's not entirely wrong that concentrated authority in a single ruler creates systemic vulnerability. Vaelor kept his voice level. He's entirely wrong about the method. Using my sons as legal instruments. Yes, without their mother's consent or knowledge. Without anyone's consent except the political factions who benefit from the instability. She looked at him, something working behind her eyes that he recognized. The specific processing of a blood law scholar encountering a legal situation in real time, cross-indexing it against 15 years of treaty knowledge, identifying the exact points of leverage and vulnerability. The succession framework he's building, she said, does it require the heirs to be physically present in Arkan Vale, or does recognition of their legal status serve the function? He blinked, because she had just asked, within 2 minutes of reading the document, the precise question that it had taken him 3 hours on the road to formulate. Recognition may be sufficient, he said slowly. The legal claim to succession attaches to the bloodline, not the location. If Aldrich can get the council to formally acknowledge Cassian and Elir as heirs of House Draxon, then their mother's consent becomes irrelevant to the succession machinery, she finished, and your authority over their legal status supersedes mine by default under the current imperial framework. She paused. Unless, he confirmed. She was already moving, back to the desk, pulling a different document from the stack. Not the intelligence report, but something from her own files. Something she had been working on. Something she navigated to with the speed of someone who had spent months building in territory that now turned out to be directly adjacent to a crisis she hadn't anticipated. The maternal sovereignty clauses in the Northern Compact, she said, half to herself. Soren ratified an expansion last year. I helped draft it. She was scanning the document with her finger moving rapidly across the text. If the boys are recognized as residents under Soren's compact, and if their maternal line holds primary custodial sovereignty under Northern law, then any imperial succession claim requires maternal consent before it has legal force. Arkan Vale doesn't recognize Northern Compact law. Not currently. She looked up. But there are 4 border territories that have observer status in both frameworks. If those territories formally recognize the Compact's sovereignty clauses as binding, Aldrich's timeline collapses, Vaelor said. He needs the succession claim to be uncontested to move quickly. A legitimate legal counterframework, even an incomplete one, buys time and forces the political calculus onto different ground. The room was quiet, with the specific quality of two people whose minds are running at the same pace in the same direction. And then Seris stopped. She set the document down. She looked at Vaelor with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd arrived, something he couldn't completely read. And he had always been able to read her, even in the worst of their times together, because she was constitutionally incapable of performing emotion she wasn't actually having. "This is the conversation," she said. "What conversation?" "The one I couldn't figure out whether to trust." Her voice was careful now, measuring each word. "You come north. You say the right things, you behave differently, and then a crisis arrives that requires exactly the combination of your imperial authority and my legal knowledge to navigate." She paused. "That's a very convenient architecture." The accusation was so precise it took his breath away. Not because it was unfair, because it was the kind of question that a genuinely intelligent person had to ask, and the fact that she was asking it rather than suppressing it out of the convenience of the emerging cooperation. That was her being exactly who she had always been, and exactly who he had failed to deserve. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Did Corva know this was coming before you left?" He thought about the answer for a moment, honestly. She suspected the council was moving. She didn't have confirmation. The confirmation arrived this morning. So it's possible the timing is coincidental. Yes. And it's possible it isn't. Yes. He met her eyes. "I can't prove to you which one is true. I can tell you that I didn't engineer this situation, and I can tell you that I understand completely why you have to ask whether I did, and I can tell you that if you decide this is a manipulation and you close that door, I won't challenge it." He paused. "But your sons are in this regardless of what you decide about me. The crisis exists whether you trust me or not." She held his gaze for a long time. This is what genuine reckonings look like. Not the dramatic confrontations of people who have already decided how they feel and are performing the revelation of it, but the actual, unglamorous, exhausting work of two people in the same room trying to determine whether the ground between them is real or a surface that will not hold weight. There are no reliable indicators, no test that definitively returns a result. There is only the accumulated evidence of behavior over time, and the judgment, always imperfect, always partial, that a person makes about whether that evidence is sufficient. She had seen him yesterday, in the courtyard, say the minimum honest thing when the maximum convenient thing was available. She had seen him this morning come to her immediately, rather than manage the situation from a position of informational advantage. She had 15 years of experience reading legal documents and the humans behind them. She made a decision. "Soren needs to be in this conversation," she said. "Agreed. Today. Now, if possible." She moved to the door and then stopped, her hand on the frame, and said without turning, "If this is real, the change, the accountability, all of it, then you do not make a single move in this situation without my input. Not one. Not the ones that seem purely political, not the ones that seem like they're clearly your domain. Nothing." "Yes," he said. "I mean that as a condition, not a preference." "I understand the difference." He paused. "I accept it." She left the room. He followed. Soren received them in his working room with the efficiency of a man who had been anticipating, based on the quality of the morning's atmosphere, that something significant was in motion. He read the document in the same focused silence that characterized everything he did. He set it down. He looked at Vaelor. "Your council did this," he said. "Yes. While you were here building something that required good faith to function." "Yes." Soren's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, the kind that a man of his particular discipline produces only when the internal pressure has exceeded a specific threshold. He was not angry in the explosive way of lesser men. He was angry in the way of someone who has just been informed that the terms of a situation he agreed to participate in were not the actual terms. "You understand," Soren said, "that this puts my territory in a political position I did not agree to be in." "Yes. The Northern Compact cannot be used as a legal instrument in an imperial succession dispute without my explicit authorization. Anyone who suggests otherwise has misread the treaty framework. Seris identified the maternal sovereignty clause, Vaelor said. We're not asking the compact to be used as a weapon. We're asking whether its existing framework provides legal protection for children who are currently under your protection. Soren looked at Seris. The look that passed between them was the look of people who have developed genuine mutual respect over a period of real shared work, not the political currency of alliance, but the rarer thing of having actually encountered each other's minds in operation and found them worth taking seriously. It does, Soren said. As long as they are resident here, under the compact's terms, their maternal line holds primary legal custody. No imperial claim supersedes that without my ratification and your consent. He looked at Seris specifically on the last two words. That's what I thought, she said. How long does Aldrich's timeline give us? Soren asked. Corva's estimate is 3 weeks before formal council action, Vaelor said. Possibly less if the messenger's arrival here alerts anyone watching my movements. Which it might, Seris said. Which it might, he agreed. Soren stood. I need to send communications to the observer status territories tonight, quietly, through channels that don't route through Ark and Vale. He looked at Vaelor with the specific directness of a man who is deciding, consciously, how much trust to extend and on what basis. You're going to have to go back. I know. Before Aldrich expects you, he paused, and you're going to have to go back without what you came for. The room went quiet. Because that sentence had more than one meaning, and everyone present understood both of them. Without the twins, without the formal recognition that would stabilize his succession, and without, though no one said this, the resolution he had traveled 4 days to begin working toward, which was now being overtaken by the crisis that the worst people in his empire had manufactured precisely to prevent anything real from being built. Vaelor stood in Soren's working room and felt the full weight of a life governed by power's fundamental character. Its absolute indifference to timing, its preference for arriving with maximum disruption at minimum convenient moments, its specific cruelty of placing the things that matter most in direct collision with the things that cannot be ignored. He thought about staying. He had the capacity to see it clearly, what staying would feel like, what Cassian and Alir might look like over the next weeks. What a different kind of morning might become available if he simply refused to walk back into the machinery that needed him. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to understand that a man who stays here and lets his empire fracture to avoid difficulty has simply repeated the original failure in a different direction, choosing his own comfort over the real consequences that fall on people who have no choice about whether to stand in the rain. When do you need me to leave? He asked. Tomorrow, earliest, Soren said. Tonight would be better. He nodded. He turned to Seris. She was watching him with an expression that had settled into something he had no single name for. Not forgiveness, not its opposite, not the middle distance of suspension. Something new. The expression of a woman who is watching someone do the difficult thing in real time and is holding that observation with the careful attention it deserves, without yet deciding what it means. I'll be in contact through Soren's channels, he said. Nothing through Ark and Vale until we know what's been compromised. Yes, she said. The boys are safe here. Her voice was even. They'll continue to be safe here. He held her gaze. He wanted to say something that would carry across the distance that was about to reopen between them. Something that acknowledged both what had begun and what was being interrupted. Something that didn't make promises he couldn't guarantee, but also didn't pretend that what had happened in this courtyard and in that archive room and in Soren's chamber had not been real. There was no perfect sentence for that. There rarely is, for the things that matter most. I'll come back, he said. I know, she said. And then, that's not the same as knowing what happens when you do. No, he agreed. It isn't. He left. The northern road was long and cold, and the evening was already closing in from the east as Bram fell into pace beside him at the gate. The horses were ready. Ben was rested enough. The Empire was 3 days south and moving, in the way of things that move without waiting for permission, toward a confrontation that no longer cared about convenient timing. Vaelor rode for an hour in complete silence. Then he said, to no one in particular, to the road and the darkening sky and the specific sensation of leaving something unfinished in a direction you could no longer see. His eyes. Bram waited. Alir, When he looked at me in the courtyard, he kept his eyes on the road. He looked like me looking at myself. From the outside. He paused. I didn't know that was something you could feel. Bram said nothing, which was the right answer. They rode through the first night without stopping, and somewhere behind them, in a northern citadel that smelled of old paper and spring cold and something that was almost home, a woman put her sons to bed and sat at her desk for a long time afterward, in the dark, and looked at a document she had been drafting for months, and began, slowly, deliberately, to write the legal framework that would reshape the architecture of an empire that had once tried to reduce her to a function of its authority. She was no longer writing in defense. She was writing in construction, and by morning, the first letter of a new compact was sealed and in Soren's hands. The Empire did not know yet what was coming toward it from the north, but the north knew, and the north was ready. Vaelor rode through 2 nights without meaningful rest, and arrived at the gates of Arkan Vale on the morning of the 3rd day, looking exactly like what he was, a man who had made hard decisions at speed and was now prepared to live inside their consequences. The city felt wrong before he cleared the outer gate, not visibly wrong, not the dramatic wrongness of banners torn down or crowds gathered in the wrong configurations or guards wearing the wrong expressions. The wrongness was subtler and therefore more serious. The specific atmospheric shift of a place where people know something is happening and have made individual calculations about whether to appear to know it. Merchants opened their stalls. The morning market operated. The wall guards changed rotation on schedule. But eyes moved differently. Vaelor had governed long enough to read a city's eyes. He kept his pace steady through the lower districts, gave no signal to Bram beyond the small tension in his jaw that Bram had learned over 40 years to interpret accurately, and entered the palace through the eastern military access rather than the main ceremonial gate. Old habit. The entrance that gave him the fastest path to the war room without passing through the council wing. Corva was already there. She looked like she had not slept in 2 days, which meant she hadn't. There were documents on every surface, organized with the particular density of someone who had been tracking multiple moving pieces simultaneously and had stopped prioritizing aesthetics in favor of speed. She looked at him when he entered and said nothing for a moment, simply assessed his condition with the clinical efficiency of a woman calculating what state her primary operative was in and adjusting her briefing accordingly. "How bad?" he said. "Worse than the report suggested. Better than it could be." She moved to the central table. "Aldrich called an emergency council session 2 days ago. You were cited as absent without adequate delegation of authority. The session produced a resolution, not binding yet, not without the formal ratification process, but the resolution formally requests an accounting of the royal succession status given the unresolved bond severance." He moved faster than your estimate. He had more support than my estimate accounted for. She paused. Lord Cassin joined him, and Mira of the southern delegation. Vaelor processed this. Cassin was a surprise. The man had been, until recently, reliably neutral on the questions of governance structure that Aldrich cared about most. Mira was less surprising, but more dangerous, because the southern delegation carried trade relationships that represented a significant portion of the empire's economic stability. "What does the resolution say precisely?" he said. Corva handed him the document. He read it standing up, the way he read all critical documents, without sitting down, because sitting created a posture of contemplation, and this required the posture of a man who was going to respond before the document had finished settling. The resolution was elegant in the specific way that legally trained political actors construct elegant weapons. On its surface, a procedural request, a governance accountability measure, the kind of thing that a council had every technical right to produce. Underneath that surface, a mechanism designed to force either public acknowledgement that the royal succession was in crisis or public denial of that fact, both of which served Aldrich's purposes in different ways. If Vaelor acknowledged it, the council's authority to demand resolution was established. If he denied it, the evidence of the severed bond, the absent queen, the foreign resident heirs existed as independent facts that made the denial look like the lie it partially was. The trap was well built. Vaelor set the document down. "When is the ratification session?" he asked. 3 days. They scheduled it at the edge of the procedural window to give themselves the appearance of proper process. Which gives me 3 days to dismantle the architecture before the vote. Corva looked at him steadily. The architecture took 8 months to build. I know. He looked at her. Tell me everyone in that council session who did not sign the resolution. She handed him a second document. There were 11 names, 11 out of 23. Not a majority, but not nothing. 11 people who had, for whatever combination of reasons, loyalty, caution, genuine disagreement with Aldrich's approach, or simply the political instinct to avoid being on record with something that might collapse, declined to attach themselves to the resolution. Vaelor studied the names. 3 of them he would have predicted. 4 were surprises in the direction he needed them to be. 1 was a surprise in the opposite direction. A name he would have placed firmly in his own column, now conspicuously absent from the opposition list, which told him the middle ground was eroding faster than the formal numbers suggested. "Get me Lord Fenwick," he said. Fenwick was on the list. 60 years old, built his family's territorial holdings through 3 generations of careful relationship management rather than military conquest. The kind of political survivor who made it to 60 by being extraordinarily accurate about which direction walls were about to fall. "He's in the city," Corva said. Council members were asked to remain available pending the ratification session. So Aldrich has them contained. Informally. Nothing he could enforce, but the social pressure of the moment creates its own confinement. Vaelor was already moving. "Fenwick first. Then I need Bram to make quiet contact with the garrison commander. Not through standard channels. And I need the full file on Casson. Whatever changed his position, it was recent, and recent changes have pressure behind them. You're going to try to pull the coalition apart before the vote." "I'm going to pull it apart," he said. Not arrogance, the flat certainty of a man who has spent 20 years understanding how political structures are built, and therefore understands exactly where their weight-bearing points are located. He stopped at the door. "Celine," he said. Corva met his eyes. "In her chambers. She's been present at several informal meetings in the council wing over the past week." "I know." He had known since the document on the road. He had been sitting with it for 3 days, the specific quality of anger that does not run hot, but cold. Cold and precise and patient, the kind that doesn't require expression to be real. "Don't move on her yet. I want to understand the full scope before anything closes." Corva nodded. He left. Bam! Fenwick received him in his private rooms with the expression of a man who has been expecting a specific knock on the door and has spent the intervening time deciding what to say when it arrived. He was small, compact, with the restless hands of someone who thinks better when moving. He was standing when Vaelor entered and did not sit down during the conversation that followed. "You look like the road," Fenwick said. "I came off it this morning. North." "Yes." Fenwick paced once, short and controlled. "How much do you know?" "Enough to be here. Tell me what I don't know." Fenwick stopped pacing. He looked at Vaelor with the specific directness of a man who has been careful his entire life and is deciding, consciously, to stop being careful for the duration of this conversation. "Aldrich approached me 4 months ago, not with the current proposal, with a preliminary version. He wanted to gauge appetite." He paused. "I told him the council had no legitimate authority to initiate succession restructuring without your direct participation. And he told me the council's legitimate authority was precisely what was at issue, and that the question of what required your participation was itself part of what needed to be settled." Another pause, shorter. That's when I understood he was further along than I'd thought. "What does he actually want, Fenwick? Not the resolution, the thing behind it." The old lord looked at the window for a moment. The same thing men like Aldrich always want when they use legal mechanisms as weapons. Not the outcome of this specific fight, the precedent. If the council can formally compel an accounting of royal succession status, then the council has established a supervisory relationship to the throne that didn't formally exist before. The precedent is the prize. The current situation just happens to be a convenient case to establish it with. Vaelor absorbed this. It confirmed what he'd been building toward on the road, that Aldrich's plan was larger than the immediate crisis, that the twins and Seris and the destabilization were instruments rather than objectives. "If I give the council what they're formally requesting," Vaelor said slowly, "an accounting of succession, on my terms, in my format, before they can force the procedural framework of the resolution, Then you've answered the question before they had the chance to make asking it into a precedent. Fenwick was already nodding, the rapid, short movement of someone whose mind has gotten there a beat ahead of the sentence. But it has to be complete. If there are gaps, he'll use the gaps to establish the supervisory authority anyway. It'll be complete, Vaelor said. Fenwick looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, assessment completing itself in a direction he had apparently been uncertain about until this moment. You're not coming back from the north empty-handed. No. The heirs. There will be a succession framework, not the one Aldrich built. A different one. Different how? Better, Vaelor said. For the Empire, which is what the Council is supposed to care about, and what I intend to remind them they're supposed to care about in front of witnesses. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. I'll be in the session, he said. I won't be alone. I know. Vaelor moved toward the door. Fenwick? Yes. Cassin. What happened? The old lord's expression closed slightly. Not evasion, the specific contraction of someone who has information they're deciding how much of to transfer. His daughter has a trade arrangement through the Southern delegation. The arrangement became significantly more favorable to her interest approximately 5 months ago. He paused. Shortly after Aldrich began consolidating. So there it was. Not ideology. Not even conviction. The oldest mechanism in political history, the arrangement of incentives until the behavior you need becomes the behavior that feels natural to the person providing it. Cassin hadn't been corrupted in the dramatic sense. He'd been positioned. Carefully over time, with the patient architectural skill of someone who understood that people rarely move for abstract reasons but move reliably for concrete ones. Vaelor filed this away and walked out. The war room that evening was not the war room of maps and border assessments. It was the war room of a different kind of campaign, the kind fought entirely in rooms and documents and the application of precisely calibrated pressure at precisely chosen points. Bram sat across the table. Corva sat beside him. Vaelor stood because he needed the ability to move. The garrison commander, Vaelor said to Bram. Loyal. Bram's voice was flat and certain. He's been watching the council movement with the expression of a man who is waiting to be told what he's legally authorized to do about it. He'll be told. Not yet. Vaelor turned to Corva. The Cassin situation. The trade arrangement with his daughter is documented. I have 3 months of records. She paused. Using them is complicated. Complicated how? Using them in a council session is coercion. Using them privately, in a conversation with Cassin before the session, is, she searched for the word, also coercion, but quieter. I'm not using them at all, Vaelor said. Both of them looked at him. I'm going to walk into that session and give the council exactly what they asked for. A full accounting. And I'm going to make the case, on the merits, in front of everyone present, for why the succession framework I'm proposing is better for the Empire than the one Aldrich built. He paused. If the merits aren't sufficient to move enough votes, then the Empire deserves whatever governance structure it ends up with. Bram stared at him for a moment. That's not your usual approach. No, Vaelor held his gaze. My usual approach is how I ended up here. The room was quiet. There is a specific moment in any genuinely transformative experience when the changed behavior becomes real. Not the decision to change, not the practice of it, but the first time it costs something immediate and concrete, and the person pays without flinching. This was that moment. Everything Vaelor was choosing not to deploy, the political leverage, the coercive mechanisms, the pressure through back channels that would have produced the outcome he needed without the exposure of actually standing in front of 23 council members and making an honest case, he was choosing not to use because the old version of power had already demonstrated its full cost, and he was no longer willing to pay it forward. It was the most frightening decision he had made in 20 years of rule. It was also the first one that felt completely clean. Aldrich was not a man given to visible reaction, but he registered Vaelor's presence in the council chamber the following morning with the specific stillness of someone recalculating a timeline that had just been disrupted. He had expected more time. The resolution wasn't due for ratification for 2 more days. Vaelor's arrival, unannounced on his own initiative before the formal session, was a move outside the expected sequence. Outside the expected sequence was exactly where Vaelor intended to operate. The chamber was full, all 23 council members present, which told him that Aldrich had maintained the informal containment effectively. Everyone was accessible, everyone was primed, everyone had been marinating in the political atmosphere of the past 2 days. The chamber itself was the formal council hall, high-ceilinged, cold despite the fires, built in the architectural grammar of a space designed to make individuals feel small relative to the institution they served. Vaelor walked to the center of the room and stood there without preamble. "I'm told," he said, his voice carrying with the flat authority of someone who does not need acoustic assistance, "that the council has formally requested an accounting of the royal succession status." Aldrich, from his position at the council table, said, "The session isn't scheduled until I'm here now." Vaelor looked at him directly. "Unless the council's request was procedural rather than genuine, in which case we can discuss what it actually was." Silence. Aldrich settled back. The calculation behind his eyes was rapid and controlled. He was determining whether this was a trap, what kind of trap it was, and whether the disruption to his timeline was recoverable. He concluded, correctly, that refusing to proceed would look worse than proceeding. "The floor is yours," he said. Vaelor looked at the room. All of them. The loyalists, the opponents, the uncertain, the positioned, the genuinely confused, the ones who had been told what to think, and the ones who were still thinking for themselves. He took a breath that was not visible and did not perform, and he told the truth. Not the managed version. Not the version with the strategic gaps and the careful framings that would have protected him from the most damaging questions. The full architecture of what had happened, the bond severance, why it happened, his own specific failures that had caused it, the 3 years of searching, the northern visit, the twins, the legal framework that Seris was building, what it would mean for the Empire's succession structure, and why it was better than the alternative Aldrich had spent 8 months constructing without anyone's authorization. He talked for 40 minutes. The chamber was completely silent throughout, not the silence of people who have been commanded to be quiet. The silence of people who are hearing something unexpected and are devoting full attention to processing whether it is genuine. When he finished, Aldrich said, "You're asking the council to ratify a succession framework that has been drafted in a foreign territory by a woman who severed her bond to this throne and has been living outside imperial jurisdiction for 3 years. I'm asking the council to evaluate the framework on its merits," Vaelor said, "which is what councils are for. And if we find the merits insufficient, then we negotiate. That's also what councils are for." He held Aldrich's gaze. "What councils are not for is constructing succession plans in private over 8 months, and then using emergency procedural resolutions to force implementation without the knowledge of the king they serve." The room went very still, because that was the thing being named, directly. In the formal council chamber with everyone present, the thing that had been operating in corridors and informal meetings and carefully maintained deniability, now standing in the center of the room where everyone had to look at it. Aldrich's expression did not change. He was too experienced for visible reaction. But something moved in the quality of his stillness. The recalculation of a man whose primary weapon has just been disarmed, not by force, but by the simple act of being described accurately in public. "I don't know what you think you've been told," Aldrich said carefully. "I know exactly what I've been told," Vaelor said. "I also know what Fenwick was told 4 months ago, when you approached him with the preliminary version of this plan. I know what changed Cassin's position on succession governance 5 months ago, and what it cost to change it. I know the contact pattern between your office and 2 exterior territorial rulers over the past 6 months. He paused. "I know about Celine." The last word hit the room differently from everything before it, because the room didn't know about Celine. The council members who were aware of the political architecture Aldrich had been building were not necessarily aware of all its components, and the component involving the Queen's cousin, a name that carried specific connotations in a chamber that had watched the royal bond crisis play out for 3 years, landed with the weight of information that rearranged the picture significantly. Aldrich said nothing. That was in itself an answer. Vaelor let the silence work for exactly the right number of seconds. Not long enough to become theatrical, long enough to be understood. And then he said, "I came back from the north without the resolution I went to find. I came back without the bond restored, without immediate custody of my sons. without the clean political outcome that would have made this conversation unnecessary. He looked at the room, not at Aldrich specifically, at all of them. I came back because this empire is real, and the people in it are real, and they deserve a king who deals with their governance honestly rather than through 8 months of private architecture. He paused. That's what I'm offering, the accounting you requested, the honest assessment of the succession situation, and the beginning of a framework that can actually hold. What you do with that offer will determine what this council is. He stopped talking. The room breathed. Lord Mira of the Southern Delegation, who had signed the resolution and who had said nothing during Vaelor's address, said, "The maternal sovereignty framework, you said it was being drafted by the former queen. By the woman who severed the bond, yes, who is also one of the most competent blood law scholars in any territory I'm aware of, and who has personal reasons to ensure that whatever framework emerges actually protects the interests of the children rather than the interests of the political structures that would use them. Can she be trusted to draft something that serves the Empire's interests, and not only the Northern Compacts? She doesn't serve the Northern Compact, she serves the law. Those aren't always the same thing, and she knows the difference." He held Mira's gaze. If you've ever read the legal reforms in the Arkenvale Agricultural Code from 3 years ago, those were substantially informed by her treaty analysis. She's been serving this empire's interests from a foreign archive for 3 years because it's what she does. It's who she is. Mira was quiet for a moment, something working behind her eyes. "I'll need to see the draft framework before the ratification session." "You'll have it." She looked at Aldrich briefly, then back at Vaelor. "I'm withdrawing my signature from the resolution pending review." Aldrich turned his head toward her with the slow, controlled movement of a man registering a structural failure and assessing the cascade. One name, one withdrawal. But political coalitions are built on the assumption of their own solidity, and the first crack is always the most significant. Not because of the vote it represents, but because of what it signals to everyone watching. The signal said, "This is not as stable as it appeared." The signal said, "The calculation has changed." The signal said, "The people on the fence now had permission to move." Casson, who had been silent throughout, cleared his throat. "The framework from the north, when can the council expect to see a draft?" "Within the week," Vaelor said. "Then I suggest," Casson said with the careful, measured delivery of a man who is repositioning without making the reposition visible, "that the ratification session be postponed pending receipt and review of the relevant documentation." Aldrich said, "The procedural window can be extended by mutual counsel agreement," Fenwick said, from his position at the far end of the table. His voice was completely calm. "Article 17 of the Council Charter, which I suspect you know as well as any of us." The room was quiet again. Aldrich looked at Vaelor. It was the look of someone who has watched a position he spent months building begin to unmake itself, and who is now doing the rapid, cold calculation of what can be salvaged, what must be abandoned, and what the exposure of the next 24 hours looks like. "Article 17 requires 7 signatures for the extension," Aldrich said. "Count to 7, Fenwick said. 7 hands went up, including Mira's. The session was extended. Aldrich said nothing more. He did not need to. He was a man who had spent 20 years in this chamber, and he understood precisely what the number 7 meant in this context. Not defeat, not yet, but the unmistakable change of atmospheric pressure that precedes weather that will not be favorable. He gathered his documents. He left without ceremony. Vaelor watched him go and felt, beneath the cold efficiency of the political calculation, something that was not quite satisfaction, closer to the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, but not yet, not quite yet, just a few more minutes of holding required. He had 3 days. 3 days to receive Seris's framework through Soren's channels. 3 days to present it, negotiate it, and build enough council consensus around it that Aldrich's architecture became irrelevant by comparison rather than defeated by force. 3 days to do the political work that the honest approach required, instead of the coercive work that the old approach would have used. He left the chamber. Bram was in the corridor outside, positioned with the patience of a man who had learned long ago not to wait inside rooms where things were happening, but to wait outside them instead, maintaining the option of moving in any direction the situation required. "Well?" Bram said. Moving in the right direction. Aldrich. Not finished. Vaelor kept walking. He'll adjust. He's been building this for 8 months. He doesn't abandon it on the basis of one session. He'll find another angle. You know what the other angle is? Vaelor slowed slightly. Because yes, he did. He had known since the morning he left the North, had been carrying the knowledge with the specific controlled attention of someone who refuses to look at a thing until they're ready to deal with it, which was not avoidance but timing. The discipline of a man who had learned, finally, the difference between the two. The other angle was Selene herself, not as a political instrument, as a person who was still inside this palace, who had information that Aldrich had already used and might still be using, and who was, and this was the piece that made the calculation genuinely difficult, someone who was not simply a political actor, but a person who had been used, who had genuine grievances alongside her genuine choices, and who deserved to be addressed as both. He turned toward the residential wing. Bram stayed where he was. The corridor to Selene's chambers was quiet in the mid-morning. Most of the palace's operational energy was concentrated elsewhere, in the wake of the council session, in the rapid recalculation of positions that follows any significant shift in political weather. 2 guards at the far end, a servant who crossed without looking up. The particular silence of a residential area that has not yet heard what happened in the chamber. He knocked. A long pause. Then, "Come in." She was standing at the window when he entered, which told him she had seen the council session break up and had been processing the implications for whatever time had elapsed between then and now. She was wearing dark blue, her hair down rather than pinned, and she looked, he assessed this without judgment, like someone who had not slept well in several days and had become expert at arranging themselves to conceal that fact. She looked at him when he entered. She said nothing. He crossed the room to the second chair and sat down, which was a deliberate choice, not standing over her, not positioning for dominance, sitting in the specific posture of someone who intends this to be a conversation rather than an interrogation. "I know what you told them," he said. She held his gaze, something in her expression that was complicated and not entirely without courage. The expression of someone who has made choices and is not going to pretend otherwise, even when the consequences of those choices have arrived. "How much trouble am I in?" she said. Her voice was even, measured. "That depends entirely on what happens in the next 3 days." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to threaten you, Selene. I'm here because you're owed an honest conversation before the political machinery processes you into something smaller than what you actually are." She blinked once, slowly. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means Aldrich used you," he said, "not exclusively. You made choices. I'm not removing your agency from the situation. That would be its own form of condescension. But you were useful to him in ways that had nothing to do with your interests and everything to do with his. And the degree to which you understood that at the time versus the degree to which you understood it later," he paused, "that's the difference between being a participant in something and being a tool of it." She was very still. "He told me," she said slowly, "that the council had the legitimate authority to establish succession stability, that you had been absent from effective governance for 3 years, that the empire needed structural clarity regardless of—" She stopped. "Regardless of what it cost personally," Vaelor finished. She looked at the floor. "He's not wrong that the empire needed clarity," Vaelor said. "He's wrong about everything else. The method, the authorization, the use of people's private situations as political material." He paused. "And he's wrong about what clarity actually requires, which is not a council takeover disguised as procedural governance, but a succession framework that was built honestly by people with the actual expertise to build it." She looked up. "Seris." "Yes." A complicated sequence of emotions crossed her face. Grief, something that might have been shame if she'd allowed it full expression, and underneath both of those something rawer. She built it. She's been building it for months without knowing this was coming, because it's what she does. Selene looked at the window. The sky outside was clear and cold, the particular quality of late morning light that neither flatters nor obscures, but simply illuminates whatever is in its path with an even, democratic honesty. "What do you need from me?" she said. It was the right question. Not what could she negotiate, not what could she demand in exchange, Not what was the political calculus of her position. What did he need? The question of someone who has finished calculating and arrived at the point where calculation is no longer the appropriate tool. I need you to stop providing information through Aldrich's channels, he said. And I need you to be willing, if it comes to a formal council review of the events of the past 8 months, to give an accurate account of what you were told and when. That will make me look, yes, he said, it will. He held her gaze. Truth generally does. It's still better than the alternative. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the lower floors of the palace, voices were beginning to accumulate. The specific gathering sound of a building processing new information, redistributing itself around changed facts. The session had been in the chamber. Now the session was in the corridors, in the dining rooms, in the rapid private conversations between people deciding what the shift in weather meant for their own positions. The Empire was recalculating. Celine said, "All right, 2 words." Quietly. Without theater. He stood. He moved to the door. He stopped. There was something else. One more thing that existed below the political and below the strategic and in the territory of the simply human. He turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "the damage I did, to you, to her, to the marriage, to all of it, that damage was mine. The choices were mine. I'm not looking for you to carry more of that weight than belongs to you." She looked at him. Something crossed her face that was too complicated to name and too private to describe without violating it. He left. The document from Soren's channel arrived at midnight on the second day. Corva brought it to him in the war room where he had been working through the council vote count with Bram for 3 hours, mapping names against positions, tracking the secondary conversations that Fenwick had been quietly running through the afternoon and evening. She set it on the table without commentary. He opened it. It was 63 pages. 63 pages of blood law, compact treaty integration, maternal sovereignty provisions, succession framework, dual territorial recognition protocols, and the specific legal architecture of a system designed not to serve any single political interest, but to make it structurally difficult for any single political interest to reduce children to instruments of succession claims without their parents' consent. It was, without question, the most sophisticated legal document he had read in 20 years of governance. It was also, between its formal clauses and its careful precedent citations, something else. A document written by someone who understood every possible way that power could be misused against the vulnerable, because she had studied it for 15 years and then lived it for 3, and who had used that understanding not to build walls, but to build architecture that was genuinely harder to corrupt. He read all 63 pages. Then he read the cover letter, 12 lines. Her handwriting, the particular small, precise script of someone who had learned to write in margins and had never fully expanded out of that discipline even when space was available. The last line said, "This is what I would have built for us, if things had been different. Build it for the Empire instead. It deserves it. So do they." He set the letter down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. Bram, who was watching him from across the table with the patient attention of 40 years, said nothing. The war room was very quiet. Outside, the palace slept, or appeared to sleep, which was not the same thing, because somewhere in the council wing Aldrich was not sleeping, was doing what men like Aldrich did at midnight when their primary plan had been disrupted, and 3 days remained before the ratification session that would now be contested terrain rather than the clean procedural victory he had built toward. He was adjusting. Vaelor knew this with the certainty of knowing his own mind reflected in a different container, because he had built things the same way Aldrich built them, had thought the same way, had used the same mechanisms for the same reasons and called them by different names. He knew exactly what Aldrich was doing at midnight, because he had been the same kind of man. And a man like that, cornered, with 3 days and the right resources, was not finished. He was becoming something else. "Tomorrow," Vaelor said to Bram, "I'm going to present this framework to the 7 council members who signed the extension. Before the formal session, I want their informed support before we walk into that room. And Aldrich, we'll be watching." He looked at the document. "And we'll be doing something tonight that we haven't accounted for yet." Bram's expression tightened slightly. "What do you think it is?" Vaelor thought about Aldrich at midnight. Thought about what a man of that specific character, with those specific tools and that specific level of investment, would do when his timeline was disrupted, and his coalition had shown its first fracture line, and the thing he'd built for 8 months was facing a genuine challenge from a direction he hadn't fully anticipated. He thought about what he himself would have done. The answer arrived cold and clear. "He's not going after the council," Vaelor said. Bram went still. "He's going after the source," Vaelor said, "the framework itself. If he can discredit the source of the legal document before the session, if he can establish that the succession framework was drafted under foreign influence or in violation of existing treaty protocols or in the service of the Northern Compact's interests rather than the Empire's, the document becomes inadmissible," Bram said, "and everything built on it collapses." Vaelor was already moving across the room to where the communication protocols were stored. "He needs one thing, one piece of verifiable evidence that Seris's work is compromised." He looked at Bram, "and the person who could provide that evidence is still in this palace." Bram was on his feet. "Celine," he said. "Get to her room," Vaelor said. "Now. Don't wait for me." Bram left at a pace that was not running but was everything that running is except the name. Vaelor grabbed his code and followed 2 seconds behind him, and the corridor outside the war room was empty and dark, and the palace around them was doing its midnight performance of sleep. While somewhere inside it, a man with 8 months of careful construction at stake was making the move that Vaelor should have seen coming, that he had seen coming a beat too late, that everything in the next 60 seconds depended on whether too late was the same thing as too late to matter. He ran. The corridor was empty. That was the first thing Vaelor registered as he came around the corner toward Celine's wing. The specific quality of emptiness that is not simply the absence of people, but the absence of the people who should be there. The 2 guards who maintained the residential corridor at night were gone. Not absent in the way of men who had stepped away momentarily. Gone in the deliberate, coordinated way of men who had been moved. Bram was already at Celine's door. He tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Vaelor once, a look that communicated the situation in full and required no words, and then he put his shoulder into the door with the efficient force of a man who has broken down doors before and understands that the time spent deliberating is always more expensive than the door. The door opened. Celine was inside. Standing in the center of the room, not at the window, not near the desk, standing in the center as if she had been placed there or had positioned herself there deliberately, in a space where she was maximally visible and therefore maximally protected by visibility. Her expression when they entered was not the expression of someone surprised by an intrusion. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting to be found. Across the room, near the secondary door that connected to the servants' passage, was a man Vaelor did not recognize immediately and then did, one of Aldrich's junior advisors, young, dark-coated, who had clearly been in the middle of a conversation that had now been interrupted by the sound of a door coming off its frame. The advisor looked at Vaelor. He made the calculation that everyone makes when they are standing in a room with the person whose authority they have been working against. The rapid, cold assessment of what options remain and what none of them cost compared to what the next 30 seconds would cost if he made the wrong move. He chose correctly. "Don't," Vaelor said. One word, flat. The advisor stayed where he was. "Celine," Bram said, "are you all right?" She looked at him and then at Vaelor. "He came to tell me that my cooperation with the Council's review would be in my interest. That if I provided a written statement about the origins and intent of the legal framework, characterizing it as foreign-directed," Vaelor said. "Yes." "And if you declined?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "The nature of my involvement with the Council's planning activities over the past 8 months would become a matter of formal record, with his characterization rather than mine." There it was. The architecture, completed. Aldrich's midnight move was not violence, not political maneuvering in the chamber, not anything that could be countered in a council session. It was the oldest mechanism available, the weaponization of a person's own exposure against them. The pressure point of making someone's choice between self-protection and honesty into a genuine dilemma rather than an obvious answer. It was what Aldrich had done to Cassin. It was what he was now doing to Celine. And it would have worked on a different night with a different version of the woman standing in the center of that room. Vaelor looked at Celine and saw, in her face, something he had not expected. Not the trapped expression of someone who has been cornered, But the specific quality of a person who has made a decision before the people who needed to know about it arrived. She had been waiting to be found because she had already decided what she was going to do, and she needed witnesses. "I already told him no," she said. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. "Before we got here," he said. "He arrived 20 minutes ago. I told him no within the first 5. She looked at the advisor with an expression that was clean and cold, and entirely without the uncertainty that had characterized her for the past 3 years. "Whatever I did, I'm not going to let it be used to do more damage to someone who doesn't deserve it." The advisor said nothing. Vaelor looked at him steadily. "You're going to go back to Lord Aldrich and tell him exactly what happened in this room. All of it, including which parts didn't go as planned." "Mom, he paused. "And then you're going to make yourself available to the council review process, because the review is happening regardless of tonight. And the difference between a man who cooperates early and a man who cooperates late is the difference between a person who made a mistake in someone else's plan and a person who constructed one." The advisor left. Bram closed the door behind him, or the approximation of closed that the door was currently capable of. The 3 of them stood in the room. Celine sat down, slowly, in the chair nearest to her, not with the collapse of someone whose strength has finally given out, but with the deliberate movement of someone who has been standing for a long time under considerable weight and has earned the ability to sit. "It's not finished," she said. "Aldrich." "No," Vaelor agreed, "but it's different now." He looked at her. "Thank you." She looked at the floor. "Don't thank me. I spent 8 months contributing to something I should have examined more carefully before I agreed to be part of it." She paused. "This is the minimum." "The minimum is where everything starts," Vaelor said. "It's not nothing." She looked up at him, something in her expression that was tired and genuine and younger than her political competence usually allowed her to appear. "Is she all right, Seris?" The question landed quietly. "She's building something that's going to outlast all of us," Vaelor said. "So yes, she's all right." Celine nodded once. She looked at the window. Outside, the night was doing what nights do, continuing impartially, regardless of the architecture of human choices being made inside the buildings beneath it. "Go," she said. "You have a council session in 2 days." He went. The ratification session arrived on a morning that had the quality of held breath, the specific atmospheric tension of a day that knows something significant is going to happen inside it and is maintaining a formal neutrality about the outcome. Vaelor had spent the previous 36 hours in the particular work that honest political change requires, not the coercive pressure of the old approach, but the slower, more demanding work of actual persuasion. He had sat with 7 council members individually and walked them through the framework document page by page. He had answered questions without deflection. He had acknowledged, when asked directly, the specific failures of his own governance that had created the conditions for Aldrich's plan to take root in the first place. That last part was the hardest. Not because it was humiliating, he had moved past the place where humiliation was the primary concern. It was hard because it was true, and truth about oneself delivered in a room full of people who have political reasons to use it is a specific kind of exposure that requires genuine willingness to be seen without the armor that power usually provides. He did it anyway, because the alternative was the old way, and the old way's cost had been paid in full by people who had not chosen to pay it. The chamber was full again. All 23. Aldrich was present, positioned in his usual seat with the composed, measured neutrality of a man who has lost a tactical round and is now engaged in the longer strategic assessment. He had not attempted another midnight maneuver. Whether that was because the night's failure had depleted his available options, or because he was planning something that had not yet revealed itself, Vaelor could not determine with certainty. He had stopped trying to determine it. He had decided, somewhere between midnight and dawn, that the only position from which he could navigate this session with integrity was one in which he was not primarily concerned with what Aldrich was going to do. The old Vaelor had governed from the center of a web of anticipation, always tracking what was coming, always prepositioning, always several moves ahead of the situation. That approach produced efficient outcomes and catastrophic blind spots. He had lived inside one of those blind spots for an entire year of his marriage, and it had cost him everything worth having. He was going to be where he was, He was going to do what was in front of him. He was going to trust that an honest case made in honest language to people who were still, at their core, trying to serve the empire they had built careers inside, that this was sufficient. If it wasn't sufficient, he would learn something important about what the empire actually was, and that too would be information worth having. He presented the framework. The 63 pages translated into the compressed formal language of a council presentation. The succession provisions, the maternal sovereignty integration, the dual territorial recognition protocols, the mechanism by which Cassian and Elir would be recognized as heirs of House Draxon without their recognition being used to override their mother's custodial rights or position them as political instruments for anyone's agenda. It was a good framework, not good in the way of things that serve the interests of the person presenting them, good in the way of things that are structurally sound, legally coherent, and designed with the kind of genuine care for the humans inside the system that most governance documents are not designed with, because most governance documents are written by people who are thinking about the system rather than the humans. Seris had written it thinking about the humans. That was the difference, and it was perceptible. Council members who read governance documents for a living could feel the difference between a document designed to create power and a document designed to protect people. The difference was in the texture of the language, the specific provisions that had no political function except to make it harder for bad actors to exploit gaps, the careful absence of the ambiguities that bad actors rely on. Aldrich, when the presentation concluded, said, "The framework was produced in foreign territory by an individual operating outside imperial jurisdiction without formal authorization from this council. The framework was produced by a blood law scholar with 15 years of expertise," Vaelor said, "at the request of the Alpha King of House Draxon, which is the only authorization relevant to the succession framework of this empire. The Alpha King, whose authority to make unilateral succession determinations is precisely what is under review." The Alpha King, Fenwick said, from his end of the table, with the mild precision of a man who has been waiting patiently for his moment and has located it, whose authority has not been formally challenged by any mechanism this council is legally empowered to deploy. The resolution before us was a request for an accounting. The accounting has been provided. The question now is whether the council endorses the proposed framework or proposes an alternative. Yes, Satashi Sham. He looked at Aldrich directly. "Do you have an alternative to propose?" Aldrich was quiet, because Aldrich did not have an alternative. He had a plan for dismantling, not a plan for building. The distinction was the one that had always separated political operators from political leaders, the ability to construct something that could stand on its own when the pressure of opposition was removed from it. His 8 months of careful architecture had been built to reduce Vaelor's authority. It had not been built to replace it with anything that would survive a direct comparison with a 63-page framework designed by someone who actually cared about getting it right. "I have questions about the Northern Compact's jurisdictional relationship to the recognition provisions," Aldrich said. "Submit them in writing before the close of session," Vaelor said. "They'll be answered." And that was essentially that. Not dramatically, not with the conclusive finality of a scene designed for maximum impact, with the quiet, unglamorous resolution of political processes when they are working as intended, which is to say, slowly, with friction, through the mechanism of genuine argument rather than manufactured certainty. The framework was endorsed by 15 votes to 7, with 1 abstention. Aldrich voted against. 6 others voted with him, the ones whose positions were sufficiently committed that no single session was going to move them. The abstention was Cassian, which Vaelor read accurately as the vote of a man who had been positioned and was now trying to find the least visible way to become unpositioned without making his journey visible. It was enough. It was more than enough. Outside the chamber, in the corridor where the Empire's next chapter was being absorbed by the people who would have to implement it, Vaelor stood and breathed and felt the specific quality of an outcome that had been built correctly. Not the sharp satisfaction of a victory won by force, but the slower, deeper weight of something that might actually last. Bram appeared at his shoulder. "Aldrich," he said. "Leave him to the review process," Vaelor said. "It'll run its course. He's not dangerous anymore. Not in the way that matters. Men who lose the thing they built are less dangerous than men who are still building it." He paused. "He'll find another long game. That's who he is. But the specific game he was playing here is finished. Bram was quiet for a moment. And the succession review process. Will the council actually implement the framework? Over time, with friction and compromise and a dozen minor modifications that will each require their own arguments. Vaelor looked at the corridor ahead, at the ordinary operational life of the palace continuing around this extraordinary morning. Yes, they'll implement it, because it's good, and they know it's good, and underneath the political maneuvering, most of them are people who wanted to do their jobs correctly. Most of them? Bram said. Most is enough to build with, Vaelor said. It's all anyone ever has. Masi. 3 weeks later, he rode north again. The spring was further along this time, the forest fuller, the road softer, the particular quality of northern light having shifted from the cold clarity of early season to something warmer without being warm, the way northern springs always compromise between the severity of what preceded them and the summer that wasn't quite ready to arrive. He rode with Bram and 4 others, lighter than the first delegation. The ceremony of the first visit had served its purpose. This one was something different. Soren's gate was open when he arrived, as it had been before. The same steward, the same efficient courtesy. But something different in the atmosphere, not warmer exactly, but less formal. The formal distance of 2 sovereigns conducting initial assessment had been replaced by the different quality of people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side with a more accurate picture of who the other person actually is. Soren received him in the working room again. The fire needed tending again. The papers were different, but equally dense. It passed, Soren said. Not a question. He had Vaelor's communication from 2 weeks prior, 15 to 7. Soren nodded. He studied Vaelor with the attentive patience that characterized everything he did. How are you? The question surprised him, not because Soren wasn't the kind of person who asked it, he clearly was, but because no one had asked him that in a long time. The operational demands of the past 3 weeks had consumed every conversation he'd had with anyone. And before that, the operational demands of the political crisis. And before that, 3 years of running an empire with the specific focus of a man who does not have the luxury of attending to the interior when the exterior is constantly requiring maintenance. Tired, he said. And then, because it was Soren and the room was honest, uncertain about what comes next. That's the right thing to be, Soren said. They sat. She knows you're coming, Soren said. I assumed. She's been not anxious, working more than usual, which for her is saying something. He paused. The framework passed as she wrote it? With minor modifications, all negotiated with her input through your channels. Soren's expression moved slightly, something that was not quite a smile but contained what smiles contain. She tracked every modification, made sure each one held the original intent even when the language shifted. He looked at Vaelor steadily. You should know that. I know. She didn't have to do that. She could have submitted the document and walked away and let the council modify it however they chose. He paused. She chose not to. Vaelor absorbed this, held it with the care it deserved. I know what that means, he said. I think you do, Soren said. And then after a moment, she's in the archive. She was not at her desk this time. She was standing at the far end of the main archive hall, at a window that looked out over the northern mountains. The view that faced away from Arkan Vale, away from the south, into the oldest and most indifferent landscape available. She was not reading. Her hands were at her sides. She was simply standing there, looking at mountains that had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. He crossed the hall without rushing. She heard him, did not turn immediately. When she did, she looked like herself. The version of herself he had come to understand during the past 3 weeks of communication and framework revision and the particular intimacy of working through difficult legal language with someone whose mind you respect, which builds its own form of closeness that is different from every other kind. You came back, she said. I said I would. Saying and doing. A pause that was not hostile but was exact. You're aware those aren't always the same. Yes. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough for conversation, not close enough to crowd the space she had built. I'm aware. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the window, which he understood was not rejection but thought. the way she had always used physical orientation to manage the process of working through something important. He stood beside her, also looking at the mountains, in the side-by-side arrangement of people who are having a conversation they are not quite ready to have face-to-face. "Aldrich," she said, "in the review process. It'll take time." "But contained." "Yes," she nodded once. "The succession provisions. Article 12. The Council tried to modify the maternal consent requirement to a maternal notification requirement. I know, I read the transcript. You rejected it. Notification without consent is a courtesy, not a protection. You wrote an article that meant something. I wasn't going to negotiate its meaning away." She was quiet for a moment. There is a specific kind of silence between two people when something important has just been said and been received, and both parties are taking the full measure of it before responding. This was that silence. It lasted longer than silences usually last, and neither of them moved inside it. "The boys want to meet you," she said finally. "Cassian has been asking since you left. He's had 17 follow-up questions about the South and has apparently been conducting what I can only describe as a cross-examination of anyone in this building who has ever traveled there." Something moved in Vaelor's chest. "That sounds like someone who doesn't stop asking questions until he gets a real answer." "Yes." A pause that contained a complicated texture. "Ilir hasn't said anything, but he's been watching the southern road from the upper window for 3 days." He turned his head to look at her profile. The winter sage in old ink, the precise economy of her face and thought. Seris. Her name said with the full weight of everything it had come to mean through the specific history of how he had failed it and what it had cost and who she had become on the other side of that cost. "I'm not here to reclaim anything. I'm not here to offer you a return to what we were. I know that's not available, and I know I'm the reason it isn't." He paused. "I'm here because you're the person I most want to be in the same place as. That's all. That's the whole thing." She looked at the mountains for a long time. There is a specific bravery required to remain open after genuine damage. Not the bravery of someone who has forgotten what they survived, not the bravery of someone who has decided the risk is acceptable, but the specific terrifying bravery of someone who understands the full cost of the last time and chooses to remain capable of exposure anyway. Not because they are naive, because they have decided that the alternative, the permanent closing of the self, the armoring that prevents damage by preventing everything, is its own kind of death, and they refuse to die that way. Seris had refused. He had watched her refuse it for 3 weeks through 63 pages of legal framework that contained, in its careful architecture, the proof of a person who had been broken open and had chosen to keep building rather than keep hiding. She turned from the window. She looked at him directly. The full, undefended look of someone who has finished calculating and is now simply present. "I'm not the same person I was when you married me," she said. "I know. And you're not the same person who was in that corridor. I'm trying not to be. Trying." She said the word with the precision of a blood law scholar examining a term. "That's honest. More honest than certainty would be." "Yes." She took a breath. "Let it out." "I don't know what this is. Whatever this is, with you here, with the boys asking questions, with the framework and the council, and all of it." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to call it something before I know what it is. I'm not going to make promises that are bigger than what I can actually see from where I'm standing." "That's exactly right," he said. "That's all I'm asking for, the chance to be in the same territory as whatever this is, and to be honest inside it, and to let it be what it actually is rather than what it would be convenient to call it." She looked at him for a long time, and then she did something he had not seen her do in 4 years. She smiled. Small, real, unsentimental. The particular smile of a person who has found something true in an unexpected place and is acknowledging it without making more of it than it is. "Cassian is going to ask you approximately 40 questions before dinner," she said. "I have answers. You don't know his questions yet. Then I'll find the answers. And if you don't have them, I'll say so." He held her gaze. "That's allowed." Something in her expression settled. Not resolved, not closed, but settled. Like ground that has been tested and found capable of bearing weight without being certain of how much. "Come on then," she said, and walked toward the archive door. He followed. Cassian met them in the courtyard with the specific momentum of a child who has been monitoring the building's exits for arrivals and has located his target. He was small and dark-haired with Seris's precise mouth and Vaelor's silver eyes, and an expression that combined both of their characteristic intensities into something that was entirely its own. The look of a person who has questions and has been waiting a reasonable amount of time for answers, and the time for reasonable has concluded. "You're him," Cassian said. Not a question, absolute declarative certainty. Vaelor crouched down, not because he was performing approachability, but because talking to someone while standing over them when they are 3 feet tall is a choice about relationship, and he had made his choice. At eye level, the silver was unavoidable. He had seen it in a mirror every morning for 53 years. It was strange, and not strange at all. "Yes," he said, "I'm him." "Why do you live in the South?" "Because that's where I was born, where my family built things." "We're your family too," Cassian said. Factual, not accusing. Simply the statement of a child whose understanding of the category is more accurate than most adults give children credit for. "Yes," Vaelor said. "You are." Cassian absorbed this with the rapid processing of a child who asks questions specifically to receive information he then immediately integrates. "Do you have horses?" "Many horses." "Are they fast?" "Some. Some are built for distance rather than speed." Cassian considered this. "Which is better?" "Depends where you're going," Vaelor said. "If you know exactly where you're going, and it's close, fast is better. If you're not sure yet, or if it's far, you want something that can keep going." Cassian looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a child who has received an answer that has given him more to think about than just the question he asked. "Okay," he said, which was the Cassian equivalent of filing the information for further consideration. Then he ran back toward wherever he had come from, because 3-year-olds have the attention span of their genuine interests, and the genuine interest had received sufficient initial data. Vaelor stood back up. Ellior was standing 5 feet away. He had not announced himself. He was simply there, the way he had been in the courtyard 3 weeks ago, watching with the contained attention of someone who has decided that looking carefully is more useful than moving quickly. He was looking at Vaelor now. That silver gaze. The patience behind it that was, as Seris had said, genuinely unusual in a person of any age. Vaelor looked back. He didn't say anything immediately. He matched the boy's patience with his own. The patience of a man who had learned over 3 years of trying to become someone better that the most important things rarely required rushing toward. After a long moment, Ellior said, "You stayed away." 3 words, precise, factual, in the particular tone of someone who is stating a thing rather than accusing it, gathering information rather than prosecuting a case. "Yes," Vaelor said. "Why?" He thought about how to answer this truthfully in language a 3-year-old could carry. Not simplified. Ellior did not appear to require simplification, just accuracy. "Because I did something wrong, and it took me a long time to understand it well enough to try to fix it." Ellior considered this. "Did you fix it?" "I'm trying. It takes longer than I'd like." "How long?" "I don't know yet." He held the silver gaze steadily. "Long enough to do it right." Ellior processed this with the interior stillness of someone who has a very good internal filing system and is determining which category this information belongs in. Then he walked over and stood beside Vaelor, not touching, but beside. The specific proximity of a child who is not committed to anything but has decided that the next piece of information he needs requires being in the same place as the source. Vaelor did not move. He stood where he was, in the spring light of the northern courtyard, with the Empire 3 days south and the complications of what came next spread across the coming months, and this child standing beside him with his own eyes and a smaller face, watching the same mountains his mother had been watching, and he felt, not the resolution of something, because resolutions are cleaner than this. They have edges and destinations, and the satisfaction of completion. He felt something more real than resolution. He felt the specific weight of being exactly where he was supposed to be after taking a very long and entirely unnecessary route to get there. Seris was standing in the archive doorway. She was watching them both with the expression of a woman who has built something real and is watching it be entered for the first time and is measuring it against the blueprint. Not to see if it matches perfectly, because nothing ever matches perfectly, but to see if it holds. It held. The afternoon moved into evening in the way of northern springs. Slowly, the light holding on longer than it had any right to given the severity of the winter that preceded it, as if the day itself had decided to be generous with the time remaining. Dinner was the particular contained chaos of a table with 2 3-year-olds at it, the competing demands for attention, the small negotiations over food, the interruptions that followed no social protocol and respected no conversational arc, the pure, unmanageable life of it. Vaelor sat at the table and ate food that Soren's kitchen had made without ceremony and answered questions from Cassian that ranged across a territory so wide and so fast that he had to genuinely work to keep up. And he watched Alir eat with the thoughtful concentration of a small person who approached everything like a problem worth solving. And he looked across the table at Seris, who was managing 2 simultaneous conversations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this alone for 3 years and had become very good at it. She caught him looking. She held the look for a moment. Then she returned to Cassian's question about whether wolves in the south were different from wolves in the north, which was apparently a matter of some urgency. After dinner, after the boys had been put to bed with the specific negotiation that bedtime requires from children who have no interest in sleep and considerable interest in continuing the day. Indefinitely, Vaelor and Seris stood on the northern battlement in the late evening light. Below them, the courtyard was quiet. The last of the daylight was burning itself out above the western ridge in long horizontal bands of color that had nothing to do with any human concern and were beautiful because of it. "What happens now?" she said, not demanding an answer, genuinely asking, in the way of someone who is standing at the edge of something they cannot see the full shape of and wants to know if the person beside them can see it any better. "I go back. Come back. Do that until there's a shape to what it is." He looked at the light. "The framework gets implemented. Your work becomes the Empire's law. The boys grow up in both places, or wherever is right for them, on terms you set." He paused. "I stay accountable to all of that. And us. The simplest question. The one underneath everything." "I don't know what us is yet," he said. "I know I want to find out. I know that what I want doesn't get to determine the pace or the direction. I know that whatever it becomes has to be built on what's actually real, rather than what would be convenient or romantic or narratively satisfying." He looked at her. "I know that I'd rather spend the next 20 years finding out honestly than spend them inside a story we told ourselves for comfort." She looked at the light for a long time. There is a particular quality to the moments when people decide things that will shape years. They rarely look like decisions. They look like standing on a battlement watching the light change, like breathing, like the small, unremarkable moment before the next one begins. "Then stay until the end of the week," she said, "and come back the week after." "Yes," he said. Simple, entirely real. Below them, in the courtyard, a light was still burning in the archive window, the lamp at Seris's desk, left on by habit, illuminating an empty room where 63 pages of law had been written for an empire that had tried and failed to reduce a woman to a function of its authority and had instead been reshaped by the architecture of her refusal. The crowns of Arkan Vale were heavy. They had always been heavy. The weight did not decrease when you finally understood what you were carrying and why. But there is a difference, which becomes clear only to those who have carried the weight for long enough and wrongly enough, and then, finally, differently. There is a difference between weight that bends you and weight that grounds you. The difference is whether you are carrying it alone. Vaelor stood on the battlement beside the woman he had failed and found again, and was only now, at 53, beginning to understand, and felt the Empire 3 days south like a weight he had not set down but had, for this evening, distributed onto ground that could hold it. The light burned in the archive window below. The light over the western ridge burned itself into dark. And in the space between those two lights, everything that had been broken and broken again, and rebuilt more honestly existed in the complicated, unglamorous, entirely real form of things that survive not because they are invincible, but because the people inside them decide, repeatedly and without guarantee, to keep building. That was what remained after the fire. Not the crown, not the throne. not the bond that had been severed clean and would not return. Only this: two people on a battlement in the last light beginning again, which is, in the end, the only thing that ever begins at all.